Chapter 23 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 23. A Piece of Strategy. A few idlers were on the platform of the station as we approached, with much apparent unconcern, our hands in our overcoat pockets where the weapons lay. "Where's the train?" I asked, looking at the bare track. "Yonder," grunted a native, pointing his thumb lazily up the road where the engine lay by the watering tank, slaking its thirst. "Well, just let me and Lockhart walk ahead," said Fitzhugh gruffly, as we started along the track. "I shouldn't have the first idea what we was here for, if you was to be knocked over." Fitzhugh could not be much more in the dark on this point than I, but I let him have his way. If someone was to be shot, I was ready to resign my claim to the distinction in favor of the first comer. There were perhaps a score of people about the car. "There's Abrams," said Lockhart. "There's no danger then," said Fitzhugh with a grin. "See, he's beckoning to us." We hastened forward eagerly. "What is it?" I asked. "There's no one here," said Abrams with a puzzled look. "Well, this car didn't come alone," I returned. "Have you asked the engineer?" "Yes." "And the fireman?" "Yes." "And they say—" "That it's against the rules to talk." "Nonsense. I'll see them myself." And I went forward to the engine. The engineer was as close-mouthed as though words were going at $1 apiece and the market bounding upward. He declined dinner, could not be induced to come and take a drink, and all that could be got out of him was that he was going back to Niles, where he would stop until he got orders from the superintendent. When I tried to question the fireman, the engineer recovered his tongue and had so many orders to be attended to that my words were lost in a rattle of coal and clang of iron. And the engine, having drunk its fill, changed its labored breathing to a hissing and swishing of steam that sent the hot vapor far on both sides, and then gathering speed, puffed its swift way back the road by which it had come, leaving the car deserted on a siding. "Here's a go!" cried Fitzhugh. "A regular puzzler." "Guess it's none of the gang after all," said Lockhart. Abrams shook his head. "Don't you fool yourself," he said. "They've landed below here, and maybe they're in town while we've got our mouths open fly-catching around an empty car." "Good boy, Abrams," I said. "My opinion exactly." "And what's to be done then?" he asked anxiously. "For the first thing, to visit the telegraph office at once." The operator was just locking his little room in the station as we came up. "No, sir, no telegrams," he said. "None for anybody." "This is a new way of running trains," I said with a show of indifference, nodding toward the empty car. "Oh, there was a party came up," said the agent. "A dozen fellows or more. Bill said they took a fancy to get off a mile or more down here, and as they were an ugly-looking crew, he didn't say anything to stop them." "I don't see what they can be doing up in this part of the country," I returned innocently. "I guess they know their business. Anyway, it's none of mine," said the agent. "Do you go in here, sir?" "Well, it will save you from a wetting." We had been walking toward the hotel, and the chatty agent left us under its veranda just as the light drops began to patter down on the dust of the road and to dim the outlines of the distant hills. "I reckon that's the gang," said Fitzhugh. "I told you so," said Abrams. "I knew it was one of Tom Terrill's sneaky tricks." "Shall we take a look for him?" asked Lockhart. "There's no need," I replied. The home guard of our party received the news calmly. Wainwright had established a modus vivendi with his young charge, and I saw that he managed to get a word out of him now and then. I had to abandon the theory that the boy was dumb, but I suspected that it was fear rather than discretion that bridled his tongue. "Do you think the gang have got into town?" asked one. "They'll have wet jackets if they are on the road," I returned, looking at the rain outside. "Hadn't we better find out?" inquired Wainwright. "Are you in a hurry?" I asked in turn. "The landlord has promised to send up a good dinner in a few minutes." "But you see—" "Yes, I see," I interrupted. "I see this, that they are here, that there are a dozen or more of them, and that they are ready for any deviltry. What more can we find out by roaming over the country?" Wainwright nodded his agreement with me. "And then," I continued, "they won't try to do anything until after dark. Not before the middle of the night, I should say, or until the townspeople have gone to bed." "You're right, sir," said Abrams. "A dark night and a clear field suits that gang best." "Well, here's the dinner," said I, "so you can make yourselves easy. Porter, you may keep an eye on the stairway, and Brown may watch from the windows. The rest of us will fall to." In the midst of the meal Porter came in. "Darby Meeker's in the office below," he announced. "Very good," I said. "Just take Fitzhugh and Wilson with you, and ask Mr. Meeker to join us." The men looked blank. Porter was the first to speak. "You don't mean—" "I mean to bring him up here," I said blandly, rising from the table. "I suppose, though, it's my place as host to do the honors." "No, no!" came in chorus from the men. "Come on, Porter, Fitzhugh, Wilson," I said, and then added sharply, "sit down, the rest of you. We don't need a regiment to ask a man to dinner." The others sank back into their seats, and the three I had named followed me meekly down the hall and stairs. I had never had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Meeker face to face, but I doubted not but I should be able to pick him out. I was right. I knew him the moment I saw him. He was tall and broad of shoulder, long of arm, shifty of eye, and his square jaw was covered with a stubby red beard. His color heightened as we walked into the office and cut off the two doors of retreat. "An unexpected pleasure," I said, giving him good day. His hand slipped to the side pocket of his sack coat, and then back again, and he made a remark in an undertone that I fear was not intended for a pleasant greeting. "There's a little dinner of a few friends going on upstairs," I said politely. "Won't you join us?" Meeker scowled a moment with evident surprise. "No, I won't," he growled. "But it is a sad case for a man to dine alone," I said smoothly. "You will be very welcome." "No, sir," said he, looking furtively at my men drawing near between him and the doors. "But I insist," I said politely. Then I added in a lower tone meant for him alone, "Resist, you hound, and I'll have you carried up by your four legs." His face was working with fear and passion. He looked at the blocked way with the eye of a baited animal. "I'll be damned first," he cried, and seizing a chair he whirled around, dashed it through a window, and leaped through the jagged panes before I could spring forward to stop him. "Round in front, men!" I cried, motioning my followers to sally through the door. "Bring him back!" And an instant later I leaped through the window after the flying enemy. There was a fall of 6 feet, and as I landed on a pile of broken glass, a bit shaken, with the rain beating on my head, it was a few seconds before I recovered my wits. When I looked, no one was in sight. I heard the men running on the porch of the hotel, so the enemy was not to be sought that way. I set off full speed for the other corner, 50 yards away, half suspecting an ambush. But at the turn I stopped. The rain-soaked street was empty for a block before me. Far down the next block a plodding figure under an umbrella bent to the gusts of the wind and tried to ward off the driving spray of the storm. But Darby Meeker had disappeared as though the earth had swallowed him up. "Where is he?" cried Porter, the first of my men to reach my side. I shrugged my shoulders. "I haven't seen him." "He didn't come our way, that I'll swear," panted Fitzhugh. "He was out of sight before I got my feet," said I. "They must have a hiding place close by." "He must have jumped the fence here," said Wilson, pointing to a cottage just below the hotel's backyard. "I'll see about it," and he vaulted the pickets and looked about the place. He was back in a minute with a shake of the head. "Well, it's no great matter," I said. "We can get along without another guest for the afternoon. Now get under cover, boys, or you'll be soaked through." The landlord met us with an air half anxious, half angry. "I'd like to know who's to pay for this," he cried. "There's a sash and 4 panes of glass gone to smithereens." "The gentleman who just went out will be glad to pay for it if you'll call it to his attention," I said blandly. "I'll have the law on him," shouted the landlord, getting red in the face. "And if he's a friend of yours, you'd better settle for him, or it'll be the worst for him." "I'm afraid he isn't a friend of mine," I said dubiously. "He didn't appear to take that view of it." "That's so," admitted the landlord. "But I don't know his name, and somebody's got to settle for that glass." I obliged the landlord with Mr. Meeker's name, and with the bestowal of this poor satisfaction returned to the interrupted meal. "Well, I reckon he wouldn't have been very pleasant company if you'd got him," said one of the men consolingly, when we had told our tale of the search for a guest. "I suspect he would be less disagreeable in here than out with his gang," I returned dryly, and turned the subject. I did not care to discuss my plan to get a hostage, now that it had failed. The gray day plashed slowly toward nightfall. The rain fell by fits and starts, now with a sudden dash, now gently, as though it were only of half a mind to fall at all. But the wind blew strong, and the clouds that drove up from the far south were dark enough to have borne threats of a coming deluge. As the time wore on, I suspected that my men grew uneasy, wondering what we were there for, and why I did not make some move. Then I reflected that this could not be. It was I who was wondering. The men were accustomed to let me do their thinking for them, and could be troubled no more here than in San Francisco. But what was I expected to do? Where could my orders be? Had they gone astray? Had the plans of the Unknown come to disaster through the difficulty of getting the telegraph on Sunday? The office here was closed. The Unknown, being a woman, I ungallantly reflected, would have neglected to take so small a circumstance into consideration, and she might even now be besieging the telegraph office in San Francisco in a vain effort to get word to Livermore. On this thought I bestirred myself, and after much trouble had speech with the young man who combined in his person the offices of telegraph operator, station master, ticket seller, freight agent and baggage handler for the place. He objected to opening the office out of office hours. "There might be inducements discovered that would make it worth your while, I suppose?" I said, jingling some silver carelessly in my pocket. He smiled. "Well, I don't care if I do," he replied. "Whatever you think is fair, of course." It was more than I thought fair, but the agent thawed into friendship at once, and expressed his readiness to "call San Francisco" till he got an answer if it took till dark. I might have saved my trouble and my coin. San Francisco replied with some emphasis that there was nothing for me, and never had been, and who was I, anyhow? There was nothing to be done. I must possess my soul in patience in the belief that the unknown knew what she was about, and that I should get my orders in due time, probably after nightfall, when darkness would cover any necessary movement. But if I could shift the worry and responsibility of the present situation on the unknown, there was another trouble that loomed larger and more perplexing before my mind with each passing hour. If the mission of today were prolonged into the morrow, what was to become of the Omega deal, and where would Doddridge Knapp's plans of fortune be found? I smiled to think that I should concern myself with this question, when I knew that Doddridge Knapp's men were waiting and watching for my first movement, with orders that probably did not stop at murder itself. Yet my trouble of mind increased with the passing time, as I vainly endeavored to devise some plan to meet the difficulty that had been made for me. But as I saw no way to straighten out this tangle, I turned my attention to the boy, in the hope of getting from him some information that might throw light on the situation. "He's as shy as a young quail," said Wainwright, when my advances were received in stubborn silence. "You seem to be getting along pretty well with him," I suggested. "Yes, sir. He'll talk a bit with me, but he's as close-mouthed a chap as you'll find in the State, sir, unless it's one of them deef and dummies." I made another unsuccessful attempt to cultivate the acquaintance of my charge. "You've got a day's job before you if you get him to open his head," said Wainwright, amused at the failure of my efforts as an infant charmer. "What has he been talking about?" I inquired, somewhat disgusted. "The train," chuckled Wainwright. "Blamed if I think he's seen anything else since he started." "The train?" "Yes, the one we come on. He's been talking about it, and wondering what I'd do with it and without it, till I reckon we've covered pretty near everything that could happen to a fellow with a train or without one." "Is that the only subject of interest?" "Well, he did go so far as to say that the milk was different here, and that he wanted a kind of cake we didn't get at dinner." I attacked the young man on his weak point, and got some brief answers in reply to my remarks on the attractiveness of locomotives and the virtues of cars. But as any venture away from the important subject was met with the silence of the claim, I had at last to give up with a wild desire to shake the young man until some more satisfactory idea should come uppermost. As darkness came on, the apprehensions of danger which had made no impression on me by daylight began to settle strongly on my spirits. The wind that dashed the raindrops in gusts on the panes seemed to whistle a warning, and the splash of the water outside was as the muttering of a tale of melancholy in an unknown tongue. I concealed my fears and depressions from the men, and with the lighting of the lamps made my dispositions to meet any attack that might come. I had satisfied myself that the rear bedroom, that faced the south, could not be entered from the outside without the aid of ladders. The parlor showed a sheer drop to the street on the west, and I felt assured we were safe on that side. But the front windows of the parlor, and the front bedroom which joined it, opened on the veranda roof in common with a dozen other rooms. Inside, the hallway, perhaps 8 feet wide and 25 feet long, offered the only approach to our rooms from the stairs. The situation was not good for defense, and at the thought I had a mind even then to seek other quarters. It was too late for such a move, however, and I decided to make the best of the position. I placed the boy in the south bedroom, which could be reached only through the parlor. With him I placed Wainwright and Fitzhugh, the two strongest men of the party. The north bedroom, opening on the hallway, the veranda roof and the parlor, looked to be the weakest part of my position, but I thought it might be used to advantage as a post of observation. The windows were guarded with shutters of no great strength. We closed and secured those of the parlor and the inner bedroom as well as possible. Those of the north bedroom I left open. By leaving the room dark, it would be easy for a sentinel to get warning of an assault by way of the veranda roof. I stationed Porter in the hall and Abrams in the dark bedroom, while Lockhart, Wilson, Brown, and I held the parlor and made ourselves comfortable until the time should come to relieve the men on guard. One by one the lights that could be seen here and there through the town disappeared. The sounds from the street and the other parts of the house came more infrequently and at last were smothered in silence, and only darkness and the storm remained. I thrust open the door to the bedroom to see that the boy and his guards were safe, and this done I turned down the light, threw myself on the floor before the door that protected my charge, and mused over the strange events that had crowded so swiftly upon me. Subtle warnings of danger floated over my senses between sleeping and waking, and each time I dropped into a doze I awoke with a start, to see only the dimly lighted forms of my men before me, and to hear only the sweep and whistle of the wind outside and the dash of water against the shutters. Thrice I had been aroused thus, when on the borderland between dreams and waking a voice reached my ear. "Hist! What was that?" I sprang up, wide awake, revolver in hand. It was Lockhart who spoke. We all strained our ears to listen. There was nothing to be heard but the moan of the wind and the dash of water. "What was it?" I whispered. "I don't know." "I heard nothing." "It was a coo-hoo, like the call of an owl, but—" "But you thought it was a man?" Lockhart nodded. Brown and Wilson had not heard it. "Was it inside or outside?" "It was out here, I thought," said Lockhart doubtfully, pointing to the street that ran by the side of the hotel. I opened the door to the dark bedroom in which Abrams kept watch. It swung noiselessly to my cautious touch. For a moment I could see nothing of my henchman, but the window was open. Then, in the obscurity, I thought I discovered his body lying halfway across the window sill. I waited for him to finish his observations on the weather, but as he made no move I was struck with the fear that he had met foul play, and touched him lightly. In a flash he had turned on me, and I felt the muzzle of a revolver pressing against my side. "If you wouldn't mind turning that gun the other way, it would suit me just as well," I said. "Oh, it's you, is it?" said Abrams with a gulp. "I thought Darby Meeker and his gang was at my back, sure." "Did you hear anything?" I asked. "Yes, there was a call out here a bit ago. And there's half a dozen men or more out there now, right at the corner." "Are you sure?" "Yes. I was a listening to 'em when you gave me such a start." "What were they saying?" "I couldn't hear a word." "Give warning at the first move to get into the house. Blaze away with your gun if anybody tries to climb on the porch." Porter had heard nothing, but was wide awake, watching by the light of the lamp that hung at the head of the stairway. And after a caution to vigilance I returned to my chair. For half an hour I listened closely. The men were open-eyed but silent. The storm kept up its mournful murmur, but no sound that I could attribute to man came to my straining ears. Suddenly there was a cry from the hall. "Who's there?" It was Porter's voice. An instant later there was a crash of glass, an explosion seemed to shake the house, and there was a rush of many feet. I leaped to the door and flung it open, Lockhart, Wilson, and Brown crowding close behind me. A body of men filled the hallway, and Porter was struggling in the hands of 3 ruffians. His revolver, whose shot we had heard, had been knocked from his hand and lay on the floor. The sudden appearance of 4 more weapons in the open doorway startled the enemy into pausing for a moment. I sprang forward and gave the nearest of Porter's assailants a blow that sent him staggering into the midst of his band, and with a wrench Porter tore himself loose from the other 2 and was with us again. "What does this mean?" I cried angrily to the invaders. "What are you here for?" There were perhaps a dozen of them altogether, and in the midst of the band I saw the evil face and snake eyes of Tom Terrill. At the sight of his repulsive features I could scarce refrain from sending a bullet in his direction. Darby Meeker growled an answer. "You know what we're here for." "You have broken into a respectable house like a band of robbers," I cried. "What do you want?" "You know what we want, Mr. Wilton," was the surly answer. "Give us the boy, and we won't touch you." "And if not?" There was silence for a few moments. "What are you waiting for?" growled a voice from beyond the turn of the hall. At the sound I thrilled to the inmost fiber. Was it not the growl of the wolf? Could I be mistaken in those tones? I listened eagerly for another word that might put it beyond doubt. "Well, are you going to give him up?" asked the hoarse voice of Meeker. "There has got to be some better reason for it than your demand," I suggested. "Well, we've got reasons enough here. Stand ready, boys." "Look out!" I said to my men, with a glance behind. As I turned I saw without noting it that Wainwright and Fitzhugh had come out of the boy's room to take a hand in the impending trouble. Lockhart and Wilson slipped in front of me. "Get back and look after the boy," whispered the former. "We can hold him here." "Move ahead there," shouted a fierce voice that again thrilled the ear and heart with the growl of the wolf. "What are you afraid of?" "Stand fast, boys," I said to my men. "Wainwright, keep close to the bedroom." Then I shouted defiance to the enemy. "The first man that moves forward gets killed. There are 8 revolvers here." Then I saw that Wainwright had come forward, despite my bidding, eager to take his share of the onslaught. And by some freak of the spirit of the perverse, the boy, who had shown himself so timid during the day, had now slipped out of his room and climbed upon a chair to see what the excitement was about, as though danger and death were the last things in the world with which he had to reckon. I caught a glimpse of his form out of the tail of my eye as he mounted the chair in his night dress. I turned with an exclamation to Wainwright and was leaping to cover him from a possible bullet, when there was a roar of rage and the voice of Terrill rang through the hall. "Tricked again!" he cried with a dreadful oath. "It's the wrong boy." End of chapter 23. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 24 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 24 On the Road The wrong boy! For a moment I could not understand nor believe, and when the meaning of the words came to me I groped in mental darkness, unable to come in touch with the significant facts by which I was surrounded. The solid earth had fallen from under me, and I struggled vainly to get footing in my new position. But there was no time for speculation. Half in a daze I heard a roar of curses, orders, a crash of glass as the lamp was extinguished, and over all came the prolonged growl of a wolf voice, hoarse and shaken with anger. There was a vision of a wolf head rising above the outline of faces a few yards away, dark, distorted, fierce, with eyes that blazed threats. And in an instant I found myself in the center of a struggling, shouting, swearing mass of savage men, fighting with naught but the instinct of blind rage. Shots were fired, but for the most part it was a hand-to-hand struggle. The clearest picture that comes to me out of the confused tangle is that of Wainwright handling his pistol like a bowie knife and trying to perform a surgical operation extensive enough to let a joke into Darby Meeker's skull. I doubt not that I was as crazy as the rest. The berserker rage was on me, and I struck right and left. But in my madness there was one idea strong in my mind. It was to reach the evil face and snake eyes of Tom Terrill and stamp the life out of him. With desperate rage I shouldered and fought till his white face with its venomous hatred was next to mine, till the fingers of my left hand gripped his throat and my right hand tried to beat out his brains with a six-shooter. "Damn you!" he gasped, striking fiercely at me. "I've been waiting for you!" I tightened my grip and spoke no word. He writhed and turned, striving to free himself. I had knocked his revolver from his hand, and he tried in vain to reach it. My grip was strong with the strength of madness, and the white face before me grew whiter, except where a smear of blood closed the left eye and trickled down over the cheek beneath. A trace of fear stole into the venomous anger of the one eye that was unobscured, as he strove without success to guard himself from my blows. But he gave a sudden thrust, and with a sinuous writhe he was free, while I was carried back by the rush of men with the vague impression that something was amiss with me. Then a great light flamed up before me in which the struggling, shouting mob, the close hall and room, and the universe itself melted away, and I was alone. The next impression that came to me was that of a voice from an immeasurable distance. "He's coming to," it said, and then beside it I heard a strange, wailing cry. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sit up. My voice seemed to come from miles away and to belong to some other man. "That's it, you're all right," said the voice encouragingly, and about the half of Niagara fell on my face. I sat up and beheld the room whirling about, the walls, the furniture, and the people dancing madly together to a strange wailing sound that carried me back to the dens of Chinatown. Then the mists before my eyes cleared away, and I found that I was on the floor of the inner bedroom, and Wainwright had emptied a water jug over me. The light of a small kerosene lamp gave a gloomy illumination to the place. Lockhart and Fitzhugh leaned against the door, and Wilson bent with Wainwright over me. The boy was sitting on the bed, crying shrilly over the melancholy situation. I tried to stagger to my feet. "Wait a bit," said Wainwright. "You'll get your head in a minute." I felt acutely conscious already that I had my head. It seemed a very large head that had suffered from an internal explosion. "What is it?" I asked, gathering my scattered wits. "What has happened?" "We've been licked," said Wainwright regretfully. "The rest of the boys got took, but we got in here. Fitz and me seen the nasty knock you got, and dragged you back, and when we got you here the parlor was full of the hounds, and Porter and Abrams and Brown was missing. We found you was cut, and we've tried to fix you up." I looked at my bandaged arm and put one more count in the indictment against Terrill. He had tried to stab me over the heart at the time he had wrenched free, but he had merely slashed my arm. It was not a severe wound, but it gave me pain. "Only a scratch," said Wainwright. I envied the philosophic calm with which he regarded it. "It'll heal," I returned shortly. "Where is the other gang? Have they gone?" "No. There's half a dozen of 'em out in the parlor, I reckon." "You better tell him," said Fitzhugh, shifting an unpleasant task. "Well," said Wainwright, "we heard orders given to shoot the first man that comes out before morning, but before all to kill you if you sticks your nose outside before sunup." The amiable intentions of the victors set me to thinking. If it was important to keep me here till morning, it must be important to me to get out. There was no duty to keep me here, for I need fear no attack on the boy who was with us. I looked at my watch and found it was near 1:00. "Tie those blankets together," I ordered as soon as I was able to get my feet. The men obeyed me in silence, while Wainwright vainly tried to quiet the child. I was satisfied to have him cry, for the more noise he made, the less our movements would be heard. I had a plan that I thought might be carried out. While the others were at work, I cautiously raised the window and peered through the shutters. The rain was falling briskly, and the wind still blew a gale. I thought I distinguished the dark figure of a man on guard within a few feet of the building, and my heart sank. "How many are in the parlor, Wilson?" I asked. Wilson applied his eye to the keyhole. "Can't see anybody but that one-eyed fellow, Broderick, but there might be more." A flash of memory came to me, and I felt in my pocket for Mother Borton's mysterious scrawl. "Give that to a one-eyed man," she had said. It was a forlorn hope, but worth a trying. "Hand this to Broderick," I said, "as soon as you can do it without any one seeing you." Wilson did not like the task, but he took the envelope and silently brought the door ajar. His first investigations were evidently reassuring, for he soon had half his body outside. "He's got it," he said on reappearing. A little later there was a gentle tap at the door, and the head of the one-eyed man was thrust in. "It's as much as my life's worth," he whispered. "What do you want me to do?" "How many men are in the street below here?" "There's one, but more are in call." "Well, I want him got out of the way." "That's easy," said Broderick, with a diabolical wink of his one eye. "I'll have him change places with me." "Good. How many men are here?" "You don't need to know that. There's enough to bury you." "Have Meeker and Terrill gone?" "Tom? He's in the next room here, and can count it a mercy of the saints if he gits out in a week. Meeker's gone with the old man. Well, I can't stay a gabbin' any longer, or I'll be caught, and then the devil himself couldn't save me." I shuddered at the thought of the old man, and the shadow of Doddridge Knapp weighed on my spirits. "Are you ready for an excursion, Fitzhugh?" I whispered. He nodded assent. "Well, we'll be out of here in a minute or two. Take that overcoat. I've got one. Now tie that blanket to the bedpost. No, it won't be long enough. You'll have to hold it for us, boys." I heard the change of guards below, and giving directions to Wainwright, with funds to settle our account with the house, I blew out the lamp, quietly swung open the shutter, and leaned over the sill. "Hold on to the blanket, boys. Follow me, Fitz," I whispered, and climbed out. The strain on my injured arm as I swung off gave me a burning pain, but I repressed the groan that came into my throat. I half expected a bullet to bring me to the ground in a hurry, for I was not over trustful of the good faith of Mother Borton's friend. But I got to the ground in safety, and was relieved when Fitzhugh stood beside me, and the improvised rope was drawn up. "Where now?" whispered Fitzhugh. "To the stable." As we slipped along to the corner, a man stepped out before us. "Don't shoot," he said. "It's me, Broderick. Tell Mother Borton I wouldn't have done it for anybody but her." "I'm obliged to you just the same," I said. "And here's a bit of drink money. Now, where are my men?" "Don't know. In the lockup, I reckon." "How's that?" "Why, you see, Meeker tells the fellows here he has a warrant for you. That you're the gang of burglars that's wanted for the Parrott murder. And he had to show the constable and the landlord and some others the warrant, too." "How many were hurt?" "6 or 7. 2 of your fellows looked pretty bad when they was carried out." We turned down a by-street, but as soon as the guard had disappeared we retraced our steps and hastened to the Thatcher stables. The rain was whipped into our faces as we bent against the wind, and the whish and roar of the gale among the trees, and the rattle of loose boards and tins as they were tossed and shaken behind the houses, gave a melancholy accompaniment to our hasty march. "Hist!" said Fitzhugh in my ear. "Is that someone following us?" I drew him into a corner and peered back into the darkness. "I can see no one." "I thought I heard a man running." "Wait a minute. If there is anyone after us, he must lose us right here." We listened in silence. Only the plash of water and the voice of the storm came to our ears. "Well, if they are looking for us, they have gone the other way. Come along," I said. We nearly missed the stable in the darkness, and it was several minutes before we roused Thatcher to a state in which he could put together the two ideas that we wanted to get in, and that it was his place to get up and let us in. "Horses tonight?" he gasped, throwing up his hands. "Holy Moses! I couldn't think of letting the worst plug of the lot out in this storm. Well, I want your best." "You'll have to do it, Dick," said Fitzhugh with a few words of explanation. "He'll make it all right for you." "Where are you going?" said Thatcher. "Oakland." He threw up his hands once more. "Great Scott! You can't do it. The horses can't travel 50 miles at night and in this weather. You'd best wait for the morning train. The express will be through here before 5." I hesitated a moment, but the chances of being stopped were too great. "I must go," I said decidedly. "I can't wait here." "I have it," said Thatcher. "By hard riding you can get to Niles in time to catch the freight as it goes up from San Jose. It will get you down in time for the first boat, if that's what you want." "Good. How far is it?" "We call it 18 miles. It's a little over that by the road. There's only one nasty bit. That's in the canyon." "I think we shall need the pleasure of your company," I said. The stableman was moved by a conflict of feelings. He was much indisposed to a 20-mile ride in the storm and darkness, yet he was plainly unwilling to trust his horses unless he went with them. I offered him a liberal price for the service. "It's a bad job, but if you must, you must," he groaned. and he soon had 3 horses under the saddle. I eyed the beasts with some disfavor. They were evidently half mustang, and I thought undersized for such a journey. But I was to learn before the night was out the virtues of strength and endurance that lie in the blood of the Indian horse. "Hist! What's that?" said Fitzhugh, extinguishing the light. The voices of the storm and the uneasy champing of the horses were the only sounds that rewarded a minute's listening. "We must chance it," said I, after looking cautiously into the darkness and finding no signs of a foe. And in a moment more we were galloping down the street, the hoof beats scarcely sounding in the softened earth of the roadway. Not a word was spoken after the start as we turned through the side streets to avoid the approaches to the hotel. I looked and listened intently, expecting each bunch of deeper darkness in the streets to start into life with shouts of men and crack of revolvers in an effort to stay our flight. Thatcher led the way, and Fitzhugh rode by my side. "Look there!" cried Fitzhugh in my ear. "There's someone running to the hotel." I looked, and thought I could see a form moving through the blackness. The hotel could just be distinguished 2 blocks away. It might well be a scout of the enemy hastening to give the alarm. "Never mind," I said. "We've got the start." Thatcher suddenly turned to the west, and in another minute we were on the open highway, with the steady beat of the horses' hoofs splashing a wild rhythm on the muddy road. The wind, which had been behind us, now whipped the rain into our faces from the left, half blinding us as the gusts sent the spray into our eyes, then tugged fiercely at coats and hats, as if nothing could be so pleasing to the powers of the air as to send our raiment in a witch's flight through the clouds. With the town once behind us, I felt my spirits rise with every stroke of the horse's hoofs beneath me. The rain and the wind were friends rather than foes. Yet my arm pained me sharply, and I was forced to carry the reins in the whip hand. Here the road was broader, and we rode 3 abreast, silent, watchful, each busy with his own thoughts, and all alert for the signs of chase behind. Thrice my heart beat fast with the sound in my ears of galloping pursuers. Thrice I laughed to think that the patter of falling drops on the roadway should deceive my sense of sound. Here the track narrowed, and Thatcher shot ahead, flinging mud and water from his horse's heels fair upon us. There it broadened once more, and our willing beasts pressed forward, and galloped beside the stableman's till the hoofs beat in unison. "There!" said Thatcher, suddenly pulling his horse up to a walk. "We're 5 miles out, and they've got a big piece to make up if they're on our track. We'll breathe the horses a bit." The beasts were panting a little, but chafed at the bits as we walked them, and tossed their heads uneasily to the pelting of the storm. "Hark!" I cried. "Did you hear that?" I was almost certain that the sound of a faint halloo came from behind us. I was not alone in the thought. "The dern fools!" said Fitzhugh. "They want a long chase, I guess, to go through the country yelling like a pack of wild Injuns." "I reckon 'twas an owl," said Thatcher. "But we might as well be moving. We needn't take no chances while we've got a good set of heels under us. Get up, boys." The willing brutes shot forward into the darkness at the word, and tossed the raindrops from their ears with many an angry nod. Of the latter part of the journey I have but a confused remembrance. I had counted myself a good rider in former days, but I had not mounted a horse for years. I had slept but little in 48 hours, and, worst of all, my arm pained me more and more. With the fatigue and the jar of the steady gallop, it seemed to swell until it was the body and I the poor appendage to it. My head ached from the blow it had got, and in a stupor of dull pain I covered the weary miles. But for the comfortable Mexican saddle I fear I should have sunk under the fatigue and distress of the journey, and left friends and enemies to find their way out of the maze as best they might. I have a dim recollection of splashing over miles of level road, drenched with water and buffeted by gusts of wind that faced us more and more, with the monotonous beat of hoofs ever in my ears and the monotonous stride of the horse beneath me ever racking my tired muscles. Then we slackened pace in a road that wound in sharp descent through a gap in the hills, with the rush and roar of a torrent beneath and beside us, the wind sweeping with wild blasts through the trees that lined the way and covered the hillside, and seeming to change the direction of its attack at every moment. "We'll make it, I reckon," said Thatcher at last. "It's only 2 miles farther, and the train hasn't gone up yet." The horses by this time were well blown. The road was heavy, and we had pressed them hard. Yet they struggled with spirit as they panted, and answered to the whip when we called on them for the last stretch as we once more found a level road. There was no sign of life about the station as we drew our panting, steaming horses to a halt before it, and no train was in sight. The rain dripping heavily from the eaves was the only sound that came from it, and a dull glow from an engine that lay alone on a siding was the only light that was to be seen. "What's the time?" asked Thatcher. "We must have made a quick trip." 20 minutes past 3, said I, striking a match under my coat to see my watch face. "Immortal snakes!" cried Thatcher. "I'm an idiot. This is Sunday night." I failed to see the connection of these startling discoveries, but I had spirit enough to argue the case. "It's Monday morning now." "Well, it's the same thing. The freight doesn't run tonight." I awoke to some interest at this announcement. "Why, it's got to run, or we must take to saddle again for the rest of the way." "These horses can't go 5 miles more at that gait, let alone 25," protested Thatcher. "Well, then, we must get other horses here." "Come," said Fitzhugh, "what's the use of that when there's an engine on the siding, doing nothing?" "Just the idea. Find the man in charge." But there did not appear to be any man in charge. The engineer and fireman were gone, and the watchman had been driven to cover by the foul weather. We looked the iron horse over enviously. "Why, this is the engine that came up with the special this noon," said Fitzhugh. "I remember the number." "Good! We are ahead of the enemy, then. They haven't had a chance to get the wire, and we beat them on the road. We must find the engineer and get it ourselves." "I've got an idea," said Fitzhugh. "It's this. Why not take the machine without asking? I was a fireman once, and I can run it pretty well." I thought a moment on the risk, but the need was greater. "Just the thing. Take the money for the horses to your friends there. I'll open the switch." In a few minutes Fitzhugh was back. "I told him," he chuckled. "He says it's a jail offense, but it's the only thing we can do." "It may be a case of life and death," I said. "Pull out." "There's mighty little steam here, hardly enough to move her," said Fitzhugh from the cab, stirring the fire. But as he put his hands to the lever she did move easily on the main track, and rested while I reset the switch. Then I climbed back into the cab, and sank down before the warm blaze in a stupor of faintness as the engine glided smoothly and swiftly down the track. End of chapter 24. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 25 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 25. A Flutter in the Market. The gray pall of the storm hung over San Francisco. The dim light of the morning scarcely penetrated into the hallways as we climbed the stairs that led to our lodgings, leaving behind us the trail of dripping garments. I heaved a sigh of relief as Trent opened the door, and we once more faced the pleasing prospect of warmth, dry clothing, and friends. We had made the run from Niles without incident, and had left the engine on a siding at Brooklyn without being observed. If the railroad company still had curiosity, after all these years, to know how that engine got from Niles to Brooklyn, I trust that the words I have just written may be taken as an explanation and apology. "Where's Barkhouse?" I asked, becoming comfortable once more with dry clothes, a warm room, and a fresh bandage on my arm. "He hasn't shown up, sir," said Trent. "Owens and Larson went out to look for him toward evening yesterday, but there wasn't a sign of him. Try again today. You may pick up news at Borton's or some of the waterfront saloons." "Oh, there was a letter for you," said Trent. "I near forgot." I snatched the envelope, for the address was in the hand of the unknown. The sheet within bore the words: "Where is the boy? Have you removed him? Send the key to Richmond. Let me know when you return, for I must see you as soon as it is safe." I read the note 3 or 4 times, and each time I was more bewildered than before. I had left the boy in Livermore, but certainly he was not the one she meant. He was the wrong boy, and my employer must be well aware that I had taken him at her orders. Or could that expedition be a jest of the enemy to divert my attention? I dismissed this theory as soon as it suggested itself. But where was the right boy? I had for a moment a sinking feeling of terror in the thought that the enemy had captured him. Mother Borton's warning that they had found his place of hiding returned to confirm this thought. But in an instant I remembered that the enemy had followed me in force to Livermore in chase of the wrong boy, and had attacked me in pure chagrin at the trick that had been played on them. That showed me beyond question that they had not obtained possession of the right boy. And the key that I was to send to Richmond, what was that? The closing portion of the note set my heart beating fast. At last I was to have the opportunity to meet my mysterious employer face to face. But what explanation was I to make? What reception would I meet when she learned that Henry Wilton had given up his life in her service, and that I, who had taken his place, could tell nothing of the things she wished to know? I wrote a brief note to Richmond stating that I had no key, enclosed the unknown's note, with the remark that I had returned, and gave it to Owens to deliver. I was in some anxiety lest he might not know where Richmond was to be found. But he took the note without question, and I lay down with orders that I was to be called in time to reach the opening session of the stock market, and in a moment was fast asleep. The stock exchange was a boiling and bubbling mass of excited men as I reached it. Pine Street, wet and sloppy, was lined with a mob of umbrellas that sheltered anxious speculators of small degree, and the great building was thronged with the larger dealers, with millionaires and brokers, with men who were on their way to fortune, and those who had been millionaires and now were desperately struggling against the odds of fate as they saw their wealth swept away in the gambler's whirlpool. I shouldered my way through the crowd into the buzzing board room as the session opened. Excitement thrilled the air, but the opening was listless. All knew that the struggle over Omega was to be settled that day, and that Doddridge Knapp or George Decker was to find ruin at the end of the call. and all were eager to hasten the decisive moment. Wallbridge came panting before me, his round, bald head bobbing with excitement. "Ready for the fray, hey? Oh, it's worth money to see this. Talk of your theaters now, hey? Got any orders?" "Not yet," I returned, hardly sharing the little man's enjoyment of the scene. The size of the stakes made me tremble. I could see nothing of Doddridge Knapp, and the uneasy feeling that he was at Livermore came over me. What was my duty in case he did not appear? Had he left his fortune at the mercy of the market to follow his lawless schemes? Had he been caught in his own trap, and was he now to be ruined as the result of his own acts? For a moment I felt a vengeful hope that he might have come to grief. But when I remembered that it was Luella who must suffer with him, I determined to make an effort to save the deal, even without authority, if the money or credit for buying the remaining shares was to be had. I might have spared my worry. The call had not proceeded far when the massive form of Doddridge Knapp appeared at the railing. The strong wolf marks of the face were stronger than ever as he watched the scene on the floor. I looked in vain for a trace upon him of last night's work. If he had been at Livermore, he showed no sign of the passions or anxieties that had filled the dark hours. He nodded carelessly for me to come to him as he caught my eye. "Have you the stock?" "All safe." "And the proxies?" "Just as you ordered." The King of the Street looked at me sharply. "I told you to keep sober till this deal was over," he growled. "You are obeyed," I said. "I have not touched a drop." "Well, you look as though you had taken a romp with the devil," he said. "I have," I returned with a meaning look. His eyes fell before my steady gaze, and he turned them on the noisy throng before us. "Any orders?" I asked at last. "Be where I can call you the minute I want you," he replied. "Now, my boy," he continued after a minute, "you are going to see what hasn't been seen in the Boards for years, and I reckon you'll never see it again." "What is it?" I asked politely. I was prepared for almost any kind of fireworks in that arena. Doddridge Knapp made no reply, but raised his hand as if to command silence, and a moment later the call of Omega was heard. And, for a marvel, a strange stillness did fall on the throng. At the word of call I saw Doddridge Knapp step down to the floor of the pit, calm, self-possessed, his shoulders squared, and his look as proud and forceful as that of a monarch who ruled by the might of his sword, while a grim smile played about his stern mouth. The silence of the moment that followed was almost painful. In that place it seemed the most unnatural of prodigies. Brokers, speculators, and spectators were as surprised as I, and a long-drawn "Ah!" followed by a buzzing as of a great swarm of bees greeted his appearance. The stillness and the buzzing seemed to take an hour, but it could not have been as much as a minute when the voice of Doddridge Knapp rang like a trumpet through the boardroom. "500 for Omega." This was a wild jump from the 325 that was marked against the stock at the close on Saturday, but I supposed the King of the Street knew what he was about. At the bid of Doddridge Knapp a few cries rose here and there, and he was at once the center of a group of gesticulating brokers. Then I saw Decker, pale, eager, alert, standing by the rail across the room, signaling orders to men who howled bids and plunged wildly into the crowd that surrounded his rival. The bids and offers came back and forth with shouts and barks, yet they made but a murmur compared to the whirlwind of sound that had arisen from the pit at the former struggles I had witnessed. There seemed but few blocks of the stock on the market, yet the air was electric with the tense strain of thousands of minds eager to catch the faintest indication of the final result, and I found it more exciting than the wildest days of clamor and struggle. "This is great," chuckled Wallbridge, taking post before me. "There hasn't been anything like it since Decker captured Chollar in the election of '73. You don't remember that, I guess." "I wasn't in the market then," I admitted. "Lord, just to hear that!" cried the stout little man, mopping his glistening head frantically and quivering with nervous excitement. "Doddridge Knapp bids $1,500 for the stock and only gets 5 shares. Oh, why ain't I a chance to get into this?" I heard a confused roar, above which rose the fierce tones of Doddridge Knapp. "How many shares has he got to-day?" I asked. "Not 40 yet." "And the others?" "There's been about 2,000 sold." I gripped the rail in nervous tension. The battle seemed to be going against the King of the Street. "Oh!" gasped Wallbridge, trembling with excitement. "Did you hear that? There! It's 1,700. Now it's 1,750. Whew!" I echoed the exclamation. "Oh, why haven't I got 10,000 shares?" he groaned. "Who is getting them?" "Knapp got the last lot. Oh, look there! Did you ever see the like of that?" I looked. Decker, hatless, with hair disheveled, had leaped the rail and was hurrying into the throng that surrounded Doddridge Knapp. "There was never 2 of 'em on the floor before," cried Wallbridge. At Decker's appearance the brokers opened a lane to him, the cries fell, and there was an instant of silence as the kings of the market thus came face to face. I shall never forget the sight. Doddridge Knapp, massive, calm, forceful, surveyed his opponent with unruffled composure. He was dressed in a light gray-brown suit that made him seem larger than ever. Decker was nervous, disheveled, his dress of black setting off the pallor of his face till it seemed as white as his shirt bosom as he fronted the King of the Street. The foes faced each other, watchful as 2 wrestlers looking to seize an opening, and the boardroom held its breath. Then the crowd of brokers closed in again and the clamor rose once more. I could not make out the progress of the contest, but the trained ear of Wallbridge interpreted the explosions of inarticulate sound. "Whew! Listen to that! 2,000, 2,100, 2,150! Great snakes! See her jump!" he cried. "Decker's getting it." My heart sank. Doddridge Knapp must have smothered his brain once more in the black smoke, and was now paying the price of indulgence. And his plans of wealth were a sacrifice to the wild and criminal scheme into which he had entered in this contest against the unknown. I saw the wreck of fortune engulf Mrs. Knapp and Luella, and groaned in spirit. Then a flash of hope shot through me. Luella Knapp, the heiress to millions, was beyond my dreams, but Luella Knapp, the daughter of a ruined speculator, would not be too high a prize for a poor man to set his eyes upon. The clang of the gong recalled me from the reverie that had shut out the details of the scene before me. "There! Did you hear that?" groaned Wallbridge. "Omega closes at 2,600, and Decker takes every trick. Oh, why didn't you have me on the floor out there? By the great horn spoon, I'd 'a' had every share of that stock, and wouldn't 'a' paid more than half as much for it, neither." I sighed and turned, sick at heart, to meet the King of the Street as he shouldered his way from the floor. There was not a trace of his misfortune to be read in his face. But Decker, the victor, moved away like a man oppressed, pale, staggering, half fainting, as though the nervous strain had brought him to the edge of collapse. Doddridge Knapp made his way to the doors and signed me to follow him, but spoke no word until we stood beside the columns that guard the entrance. The rain fell in a drizzle, but anxious crowds lined the streets, dodged into doorways for shelter, or boldly moved across the walks and the cobbled roadway under the protection of bobbing umbrellas. The news of the unprecedented jump in Omega, in which the price had doubled thrice in a few minutes, had flown from mouth to mouth, and excitement was at fever heat. "That was warm work," said Doddridge Knapp, after a moment's halt. "I was very sorry to have it turn out so," I said. A grim smile passed over his face. "I wasn't," he growled good-humoredly. "I thought it was rather neatly done." I looked at him in surprise. "Oh, I forgot that I hadn't seen you," he continued. "And like enough I shouldn't have told you if I had. The truth is, I found a block of 4,000 shares on Saturday night, and made a combination with them." "Then the mine is yours?" "The directors will be." "But you were buying shares this morning." "A mere optical illusion, Wilton. I was, in fact, a seller, for I had shares to spare." "It was a very good imitation." "I don't wonder you were taken in, my boy. Decker was fooled to the tune of about $1 million this morning. I thought it was rather neat for a clean-up." I thought so too, and the King of the Street smiled at my exclamations over his cleverness. But my congratulations were cut short as a small dark man pressed his way to the corner where we stood and whispered in Doddridge Knapp's ear. "Was he sure?" asked the King of the Street. "Those were his exact words." "When was this?" "Not 5 minutes ago." "Run to Caswell's. Tell him to wait for me." The messenger darted off, and we followed briskly. Caswell, I found, was an attorney, and we were led at once to the inner office. "Come in with me," said my employer. "I expect I shall need you, and it will save explanations." The lawyer was a tall, thin man, with chalky, expressionless features, but his eyes gave life to his face with their keen, almost brilliant vision. "Decker's playing the joker," said the King of the Street. "I've beaten him in the market, but he's going to make a last play with the directors. There's a meeting called for 12:30. They are going to give him a 2 years' contract for milling, and they talk of declaring 20,000 shares of my stock invalid." "How many directors have you got?" "Two. Barber and myself. Decker thinks he has Barber." "Then you want an injunction?" "Yes." The lawyer looked at his watch. "The meeting is at 12:30. You'll have to hold them for half an hour, maybe an hour." "Make it half an hour," growled Doddridge Knapp. "Just remember that time is worth $1,000 a second till that injunction is served." He went out without another word, and there was a commotion of clerks as we left. "How's your nerve, Wilton?" inquired the King of the Street calmly. "Are you ready for some hot work?" "Quite ready." "Have you a revolver about you?" "Yes." "Very good. I don't want you to kill anyone, but it may come in handy as an evidence of your good intentions." He led the way to California Street below Sansome, where we climbed a flight of stairs and went down a hall to a glass door that bore the gilt and painted letters: Omega Mining Company, J. D. Storey, President. "There's 5 minutes to spare," said my employer. "He may be alone." A stout, florid man, with red side whiskers and a general air of good living, sat by an overshadowing desk in the handsome office, and looked sourly at us as we entered. He was not alone, for a young man could be seen in a side room that was lettered "Secretary's Office." "Ah, Mr. Knapp," he said, bowing deferentially to the millionaire, and rubbing his fat red hands. "Can I do anything for you today?" "I reckon so, Story. Let me introduce you to Mr. Wilton, one of our coming directors." I had an inward start at this information, and Mr. Story regarded me unfavorably. We professed ourselves charmed to see each other. "I suppose it was an oversight that you didn't send me a notice of the directors' meeting," said Doddridge Knapp. Mr. Story turned very red, and the King of the Street said in an undertone, "Just lock that door, Wilton." "It must have been sent by mail," stammered Story. "Hi there! Young man, what are you doing?" he exclaimed, jumping to his feet as I turned the key in the lock. "Open that door again." "No you don't, Story," came the fierce growl from the throat of the Wolf. "Your game is up." "The devil it is!" cried Story, making a dash past Doddridge Knapp and coming with a rush straight for me. "Stop him!" roared my employer. I sprang forward and grappled Mr. Story, but I found him rather a large contract, for I had to favor my left arm. Then he suddenly turned limp and rolled to the floor, his head thumping noisily on a corner of the desk. Doddridge Knapp coolly laid a hard rubber ruler down on the desk, and I recognized the source of Mr. Story's discomfiture. "I reckon he's safe for a bit," he growled. "Hullo, what's this?" I noted a very pale young man in the doorway of the secretary's office, apparently doubtful whether he should attempt to raise an alarm or hide. "You go back in your room and mind your own business, Dodson," said the King of the Street. "Go!" he growled fiercely, as the young man still hesitated. "You know I can make or break you." The young man disappeared, and I closed and locked the door on him. "There they come," said I, as steps sounded in the hall. "Stand by the door and keep them out," whispered my employer. "I'll see that Story doesn't get up. Keep still now. Every minute we gain is worth $10,000. I took station by the door as the knob was tried. More steps were heard, and the knob was tried again. Then the door was shaken, and picturesque comments were made on the dilatory president. Doddridge Knapp looked grim, but serene, as he sat on the desk with his foot on the prostrate Story. I breathed softly, and listened to the rising complaints from without. There were thumps and kicks on the door, and at last a voice roared, "What are you waiting for? Break it in!" A crash followed, and the ground glass upper section of the door fell in fragments. "I beg your pardon, gentlemen," I said, as a man put his hand through the opening. "This revolver is loaded, and the first man to come through there will get a little cold lead in him." There was a pause, and then a storm of oaths. "Get in there!" cried Decker's voice from the rear. "What are you afraid of?" "He's got a gun." "Well, get in, 3 or 4 of you at once. He can't shoot you all." This spirited advice did not seem to find favor with the front rank men, and the enemy retired for consultation. At last a messenger came forward. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to keep out." "Who is he?" asked Decker's voice. "There's another one there," cried another voice. Why, it's Doddridge Knapp!" Decker made use of some language not intended for publication, and there was whispering for a few minutes, followed by silence. I looked at Doddridge Knapp, sitting grim and unmoved, counting the minutes till the injunction should come. Suddenly a man bounded through the broken upper section of the door, tossed by his companions, and I found myself in a grapple before I could raise my revolver. We went down on the floor together, and I had a confused notion that the door swung open and 4 or 5 others rushed into the room. I squirmed free from my opponent and sprang to my feet in time to see the whole pack around Doddridge Knapp. The King of the Street sat calm and forceful with a revolver in his hand, and all had halted, fearing to go farther. "Don't come too close, gentlemen," growled the Wolf. Then I saw one of the men raise a 6-shooter to aim at the defiant figure that faced them. I gave a spring and with one blow laid the man on the floor. There was a flash of fire as he fell, and a deafening noise was in my ears. Men all about me were striking at me. I scarcely felt the blows as I warded them off and returned them, for I was half mad with the desperate sense of conflict against odds. But at last I felt myself seized in an iron grip, and in a moment was seated beside Doddridge Knapp on the desk. "The time is up," he said. "There's the sheriff and Caswell with the writ." "I congratulate you," I answered, my head still swimming, noting that the enemy had drawn back at the coming of reinforcements. "Good heavens, man, you're hurt!" he cried, pointing to my left sleeve where a blood stain was spreading. The wound I had received in the night conflict at Livermore had reopened in the struggle. "It's nothing," said I. "Just a scratch." "Here, get a doctor!" cried the King of the Street. "Gentlemen, the directors' meeting is postponed by order of court." End of chapter 25. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 26 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 26. A Vision of the Night. "You are a very imprudent person," said Luella, smiling, yet with a most charming trace of anxiety under the smile. "What have I been doing now?" I asked. "That is what you are to tell me. Papa told us a little about your saving his life and his plans this morning, but he was so very short about it. Let me know the whole story from your own mouth. Was this the arm that was hurt?" I started to give a brief description of my morning's adventure, but there was something in my listener's face that called forth detail after detail, and her eyes kindled as I told the tale of the battle that won Omega in the stock board, and the fight that rescued the fruits of victory in the office of the company. "There is something fine in it, after all," she said when I was through. "There is something left of the spirit of the old adventurers and the knights. Oh, I wish I were a man. No, I don't either. I'd rather be the daughter of a man, a real man, and I know I am that." I thought of the Doddridge Knapp that she did not know, and a pang of pity and sorrow wrenched my heart. She saw the look and misinterpreted it. "You do not think, do you," she said softly, "that I don't appreciate your part in it? Indeed, I do." I took her hand, and she let it lie a moment before she drew it away. "I think I am more than repaid," I said. "Oh, yes," said she, changing her tone to one of complete indifference. "Papa said he had made you a director." "Yes," I said, taking my cue from her manner. "I have the happiness to share the honor with 3 other dummies." Your father makes the fifth."
"How absurd!" laughed Luella. "Do you want to provoke me?"
"Oh, of course. I mean that your father does the thinking, and—"
"And you punch the head he points out to you, I suppose," said Luella sarcastically.
"Exactly," I said. "And—" "Don't mind me, Henry," interrupted the voice of Mrs. Knapp. "But I must," said I, giving her greeting. "What service do you require?" "Tell me what you have been doing." "I have just been telling Miss Luella." "And what, may I ask?" "I was explaining this morning's troubles." "Oh, I heard a little of them from Mr. Knapp. Have you had any more of your adventures at Borton's and other dreadful places?" I glanced at Luella. She was leaning forward, her chin resting on her hand, and her eyes were fixed on me with close attention.
"I should like to hear of them, too," she said.
I considered a moment, and then, as I could see no reason for keeping silent, I gave a somewhat abridged account of my Livermore trip, omitting reference to the strange vagaries of the Doddridge Knapp who traveled by night. I had reason to be flattered by the attention of my audience. Both women leaned forward with wide open eyes, and followed every word with eager interest. "That was a dreadful danger you escaped," said Mrs. Knapp with a shudder. "I am thankful, indeed, to see you with us with no greater hurt." Luella said nothing, but the look she gave me set my heart dancing in a way that all Mrs. Knapp's praise could not. "I do hope this dreadful business will end soon," said Mrs. Knapp. "Do you think this might be the last of it?" "No," said I, remembering the note I had received from the Unknown on my return. "There's much more to be done." "I hope you are ready for it," said Mrs. Knapp, with a troubled look upon her face. "As ready as I ever shall be, I suppose," I replied. "If the guardian angel who has pulled me through this far will hold on to his job, I'll do my part." Mrs. Knapp raised a melancholy smile, but it disappeared at once, and she seemed to muse in silence, with no very pleasant thought in her mind. Twice or thrice I thought she wished to speak to me, but if so, she changed her mind. I ventured a few observations that were intended to be jocose, but she answered in the monosyllables of preoccupation, and I turned to Luella. She gave back flashes of brightness, but I saw on her face the shadow of her mother's melancholy, and I rose at an early hour to take my leave. "I wonder at you," said Luella softly, as we stood alone for a moment. "You have little cause." "What you have done is much. You have conquered difficulties." I looked in her calm eyes, and my soul came to the surface. "I wish you might be proud of me," I said. "I am proud of such a friend, except—" She hesitated. "Always an except," I said, half bitterly. "But you have promised to tell me." "Some day. As soon as I may." Under her magnetic influence, I should have told her then had she urged me. And not until I was once more outside the house did I recall how impossible it was that I could ever tell her. "What shall I do? What shall I do?" was the refrain that ran through my brain insistently, as the battle between love and duty rose and swelled. And I was sorely tempted to tell the Unknown to look elsewhere for assistance, and to bury the memory of my dead friend and the feud with Doddridge Knapp in a common grave. "Here's some one to see you, sir," said Owens, as I reached the walk, and joined the guards I had left to wait for me. The rain had ceased, but the wind, which had fallen during the day, was freshening once more from the south. "Yes, sir, you're wanted at Mother Borton's in a hurry," said another voice, and a man stepped forward. "There's the devil to pay."
I recognized the one-eyed man who had done me the service that enabled me to escape from Livermore. "Ah, Broderick! What's the matter?" "I didn't get no orders, sir, so I don't know, but there was the devil's own shindy in the height of progression when I left. And Mother Borton says I was to come hot foot for you and tell you to come with your men if you valued your soul." "Is she in danger?" "I reckon the thought was heavy on her mind, for her face was white with the terror of it." We hastened forward, but at the next corner a passing hack stood ready for passengers, and we rolled down the street, the horse's hoofs outstripped by my anxiety and apprehensions. One of the men was sent to bring out such of my force as had returned, and I, with the two others, hurried on to Borton's. There was none of the sounds of riot I had expected to hear as we drew up before it. The lantern blinked outside with its invitation to manifold cheer within. Lights streamed through the window and the half-open door, and quiet and order reigned. As I stepped to the walk, I found the explanation of the change in the person of a policeman who stood at the door. "Holy St. Peter! The cops is on!" whispered Broderick. I failed to share his trepidation in the presence of the representative of law and order, and stepped up to the policeman. "Has there been trouble here, officer?" I asked. "Oh, is it you, sir?" said Corson's hearty voice. "I was wondering about you. Well, there has been a bit of a row here, and there's a power of broken heads to be mended. There's one man cut to pieces, and good riddance, for it's Black Dick. I'm thinking it's the morgue they'll be taking him to, though it was for the receiving hospital they started with him. It was a dandy row, and it was 17 arrests we made." "Where is Mother Borton?" "The old she-devil's done for this time, I'm a-thinking. Whist, I forgot she was a friend of yours, sor." "Where is she? At the receiving hospital? What is the matter with her?" "Aisy, aisy, sor. It may be nothing. She's upstairs. A bit of a cut, they say. Here, Shaughnessy, look out for this door. I'll take ye up, sir." We mounted the creaking stairs in the light of the smoky lamp that stood on the bracket, and Corson opened a door for me. A flickering candle played fantastic tricks with the furniture, sent shadows dancing over the dingy walls, and gave a weird touch to the two figures that bent over the bed in the corner. The figures straightened up at our entrance, and I knew them for the doctor and his assistant. "A friend of the lady, sir," whispered Corson. The doctor looked at me in some surprise, but merely bowed. "Is she badly hurt?" I asked. "I've seen worse," he answered in a low voice. "But—" and he completed the sentence by shrugging his shoulders, as though he had small hopes for his patient. Mother Borton turned her head on the pillow, and her gaunt face lighted up at the sight of me. Her eyes shone with a strange light of their own, like the eyes of a night bird, and there was a fierce eagerness in her look. Dearie, I knew you would come," she cried. The doctor pushed his way to the bedside. "I must insist that the patient be quiet," he said with authority. "Be quiet!" cried Mother Borton. "Is it for the likes of you that I'd be quiet? You whitewashed tombstone raiser, you body snatcher, do you think you're the man to tell me to hold my tongue when I want to talk to a gentleman?" "Hush!" I said soothingly. "He means right by you." "You must lie quiet, or I'll not be responsible for the consequences," said the doctor firmly. At these well-meant words Mother Borton raised herself on her elbow and directed a stream of profanity in the direction of the doctor that sent chills chasing each other down my spine. and seemed for a minute to dim the candle that gave its flickering gloom to the room. "I'll talk as I please," cried Mother Borton. "It's my last wish, and I'll have it. You tell me I'll live an hour or two longer if I'm quiet, but I'll die as I've lived, a doin' as I please, and have my say as long as I've got breath to talk. Go out now, all of you but this man. Go!" Mother Borton had raised herself upon one elbow. Her face, flushed and framed in her gray and tangled hair, was working with anger, and her eyes were almost lurid as she sent fierce glances at one after another of the men about her. She pointed a skinny finger at the door, and each man, as she cast her look upon him, went out without a word. "Shut the door, honey," she said quietly, lying down once more with a satisfied smile. "That's it. Now me and you can talk cozy like." "You'd better not talk. Perhaps you will feel more like it tomorrow." "There won't be any tomorrow for me," growled Mother Borton. "I've seen enough of 'em carved to know when I've got the dose myself. Curse that knife!" and she groaned at a twinge of pain. "Who did it?" "Black Dick, curse his soul! And he's roasting in hell for it this minute," cried Mother Borton savagely. "Hush!" I said. "You mustn't excite yourself. Can't I get you a minister or a priest?" Mother Borton spat out another string of oaths. "Priest or minister! Not for me. No one has passed my door in all the time I've lived, and he'll not do it tonight. What could he tell me that I don't know already? I've been on the road to hell for 50 years, and do you think the devil will let go his grip for a man that don't know me? No, dearie. Your face is better for me than priest or minister, and I want you to close my eyes and see that I'm buried decent. Maybe you'll remember Mother Borton for something more than a vile old woman when she's gone." "That I shall," I exclaimed, touched by her tone, and taking the hand that she reached out to mine. "I'll do anything you want, but don't talk of dying. There's many a year left in you yet." "There's maybe an hour left in me. But we must hurry. Tell me about your trouble. At Livermore, was it?" I gave her a brief account of the expedition and its outcome. Mother Borton listened eagerly, giving an occasional grunt of approval. "Well, honey, I was some good to you after all," was her comment. "Indeed, yes." "And you had a closer shave for your life than you think," she continued. "Tom Terrill swore he'd kill you, and it's one of the miracles, sure, that he didn't." "Well, Mother Borton, Tom Terrill's laid up in Livermore with a broken head, and I'm safe here with you, ready to serve you in any way that a man may." "Safe? Safe?" mused Mother Borton, an absent look coming over her skinny features as though her mind wandered. Then she turned to me impressively. "You'll never be safe till you change your work and your name. You've shut your ears to my words while I'm alive, but maybe you'll think of 'em when I'm in my coffin. I tell you now, my boy, there's murder and death before you. Do you hear? Murder and death." She sank back on her pillow and gazed at me with a wearied light in her eyes and a sibyl look on her face. "I think I understand," I said gently. "I have faced them, and I ought to know them." "Then you'll quit your job? You'll be yourself?" "I cannot. I must go on." "And why?" "My friend, his work, his murderer." "Have you got the man who murdered Henry Wilton?" "No." "Have you got a man who will give a word against You know who?" "I have not a scrap of evidence against anyone but the testimony of my own eyes," I was compelled to confess. "And you can't use it. You dare not use it. Now I'll tell you, dearie, I know the man as killed Henry Wilton." "Who was it?" I cried, startled into eagerness. "It was Black Dick, the cursed scoundrel that's done for me. Oh!" She groaned in pain. "Maybe Black Dick struck the blow, but I know the man that stood behind him, and paid him, and protected him, and I'll see him on the gallows before I die." "Hush!" cried Mother Borton, trembling. "If he should hear you, your throat will be cut yet, dearie, and I'm to blame. Drop it, dearie, drop it. The boy is nothing to you. Leave him go. Take your own name and get away. This is no place for you. When I'm gone, there will be no one to warn you. You'll be killed. You'll be killed." Then she moaned, but whether from pain of body or mind I could not guess. "Never you fear. I'll take care of myself," I said cheerily. She looked at me mournfully. "I am killed for ye, dearie." I started, shocked at this news. "There," she continued slowly, "I didn't mean to let you know, but they thought I had told you." "Then I have two reasons instead of one for holding to my task," I said solemnly. "I have two friends to avenge." "You'll make the third yourself," groaned Mother Borton, "unless they put a knife into Barkhouse first, and then you'll be the fourth belike." "Barkhouse? Do you know where he is?" "He's in the Den, on Davis Street, you know. I was near forgetting to tell you. Send your men to get him to-night, for he's hurt and like to die. They may have to fight. No, don't leave me now." "I wasn't going to leave you." Mother Borton put her hand to her throat as though she choked, and was silent for a moment. Then she continued: "I'll be to blame if I don't tell you. I must tell you. Are you listening?" Her voice came thick and strange, and her eyes wandered anxiously about, searching the heavy shadows with a look of growing fear. The candle burned down till it guttered and flickered in its pool of melted tallow, and the shadows it threw upon wall and ceiling seemed instinct with an impish life of their own, as though they were dark spirits from the pit, come to mock the final hours of the life that was ebbing away before me. "I am listening," I replied. "You must know. You must know. I must tell you. The boy the woman is—" On a sudden Mother Borton sat bolt upright in bed, and a shriek, so long, so shrill, so freighted with terror, came from her lips that I shrank from her and trembled, faint with the horror of the place. "They come! There they come!" she cried, and throwing up her arms, she fell back on the bed. The candle shot up into flame, sputtered an instant, and was gone. And I was alone with the darkness and the dead. End of chapter 26. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 27 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 27. A Link in the Chain. I sprang to my feet. The darkness was instinct with nameless terrors. The air was filled with nameless shapes. A spiritual horror surrounded me, and I felt that I must reach the light or cry out.
But before I had covered the distance to the door, it was flung open, and Corson stood on the threshold. And at the sight of him my courage returned, and my shaken nerves grew firm. At the darkness he wavered and cried, "What's the matter here?" "She is dead." "Rest her soul! It's a fearsome dark hole to be in, sir." I shuddered as I stood beside him, and brought the lamp from the bracket in the hall. Mother Borton lay back staring affrightedly at the mystic beings who had come for her, but settled into peace as I closed her eyes and composed her limbs. "She was a rare old bird," said Corson when I had done, "but there was some good in her after all." "She has been a good friend to me," I said, and we called a servant from below and left the gruesome room to his guardianship. "And now there's another little job to be done. There's one of my men a prisoner down on Davis Street. I must get him out." "I'm with you, sor," said Corson heartily. "I'm hoping there's some heads to be cracked." I had not counted on the policeman's aid, but I was thankful to accept the honest offer. In the restaurant I found 5 of my men, and with this force I thought that I might safely attempt an assault on the den. The den was a low, 2-story building of brick, with a warehouse below, and the quarters of the enemy, approached by a narrow stairway, above. "Step quietly," I cautioned my men as we neared the dark and forbidding entrance. "Keep close to the shadow of the buildings. Our best chance is in a surprise." There was no guard at the door that stood open to the street, and we halted a moment before it to make sure of our plans. "It's a bad hole," whispered Corson. "A fine place for an ambush," I returned dubiously. "Well, there's no help for it," said the policeman. "Come on." And drawing his club and revolver, he stole noiselessly up the stairs. I felt my way up, step by step, one hand against the wall, and my shoes scraping cautiously for a resting place, while my men followed in single file with the same silent care. But in spite of this precaution, we were not 2/3 the way up the flight before a voice shot out of the darkness. "Who's there?" We stopped and held our breath. There was a minute of silence, but it was broken by the creak of a board as one of the men shifted his weight. "There's someone here!" cried the voice above us. "Halt, or I'll shoot! Peterson! Conn! Come quick!" There was no more need for silence, and Corson and I reached the landing just as a door opened that let the light stream from within. 2 men had sprung to the doorway, and another could be seen faintly outlined in the dark hall. "Holy Mother! It's the cops!" came in an awe-stricken voice at the sight of Corson's star. "Right, my hearty!" cried Corson, making a rush for the man, who darted down the hall in an effort to escape. The 2 men jumped back into the room and tried to close the door, but I was upon them before they could swing it shut. 4 of my men had followed me close, and with a few blows, given and taken, the 2 were prisoners. "Tie them fast," I ordered, and hastened to see how Corson fared. I met the worthy policeman in the hall, blown but exultant. Owens was following him, and between them they half dragged, half carried the man who had given the alarm. "He made a fight for it," puffed Corson, "but I got in one good look at him and he wilted. You'll surrender next time when I tell you, won't you, me buck?" "Aren't there any more about?" I asked. "There were more than 3 left in the gang." "If there had been more of us you'd never have got in," growled one of the prisoners. "Where's Barkhouse?" I asked. "Find him," was the defiant reply. We began the search, opening one room after another. Some were sleeping rooms, some the meeting rooms,
while the one we had first entered appeared to be the guard room.
"Hello, what's this?"
exclaimed Corson, tapping an iron door, such as closes a warehouse against fire.
"It's locked, sure enough,"
said Owens, after trial.
"It must be the place we are looking for,"
I said. "Search those men for keys." The search was without result.
"It's a sledge we must get,"
said Owens, starting to look about for one.
"Hold on," said Corson. "I was near forgetting. I've got a master key that fits most of these locks. It's handy for closing up a warehouse when some clerk with his wits a-wandering forgets his job. So like enough it's good at unlocking."
It needed a little coaxing, but the bolt at last slid back and the heavy doors swung open. The room was furnished with a large table, a big desk, and a dozen chairs, which sprang out of the darkness as I struck a match and lit the gas. It was evidently the council room of the enemy.
"This is elegant,"
said the policeman, looking around with approval.
"But your man isn't here, I'd say."
"Well, it looks as though there might be something here of interest," I replied, seizing eagerly upon the papers that lay scattered about upon the desk. "Look in the other rooms while I run through these." A rude diagram on the topmost paper caught my eye. It represented a road branching thrice. On the third branch was a cross, and then at intervals 4 crosses, as if to mark some features of the landscape. Underneath was written, "From B, follow 1 1/2 mile. Take third road, 3 or 5. The paper bore date of that day, and I guessed that it was meant to show the way to the supposed hiding place of the boy. Then, as I looked again, the words and lines touched a chord of memory. Something I had seen or known before was vaguely suggested. I groped in the obscurity for a moment, vainly reaching for the phantom that danced just beyond the grasp of my mental fingers. There was no time to lose in speculating, and I turned to the work that pressed before us. But as I thrust the papers into my pocket to resume the search for Barkhouse, the elusive memory flashed on me. The diagram of the enemy recalled the single slip of paper I had found in the pocket of Henry Wilton's coat on the fatal night of my arrival. I had kept it always with me, for it was the sole memorandum left by him of the business that had brought him to his death. I brought it out, very badly creased and rumpled from much carrying, but still quite as legible as on the night I had first seen it. Placed side by side with the map I had before me, the resemblance was less close than I had thought. Yet all the main features were the same. There was the road branching thrice, a cross in both marked the junction of the third road as though it gave sign of a building or some natural landmark. And the other features were indicated in the same order. No. There was a difference in this point. There were 5 crosses on the third road in the enemy's diagram, while there were but 4 in mine. In the matter of description the enemy had the advantage, slight as it was. Third road, cock-eyed barn, iron cow, and the confused jumble of drunken letters and figures that Henry had written. I could make nothing of these. From B, follow 1 1/2 mile. Take third road, 3 or 5. This was at least half intelligible. Then it came on me like a blow. Was this the mysterious key that the unknown had demanded of me in her letter of this morning? I turned sick at heart at the thought that my ignorance and inattention had put the boy in jeopardy. The enemy had perhaps a clue to the hiding place that the unknown did not possess. The desertion of these headquarters swelled my fears. Though Terrill, disabled by wounds, was groaning with pain and rage at Livermore, and the night's arrests at Borton's had reduced the numbers of the band, Darby Meeker was still on the active list. And Doddridge Knapp? He was free now to follow his desperate plot to its end without risking his schemes of fortune. The absence of Meeker, the date of today upon the map, suggested that it had but just come into the hands of the enemy, and the lack of a garrison in the Den raised the apprehension that fresh mischief was afoot. I was roused from my reverie of fears by confused shouts from down the hall, and sprang hastily to the door, with the thought that the forces of the enemy were upon us. "Here he is! They've found him!" cried an excited voice. "Yes, sir. Here he comes." It was truly the stalwart guard, but 2 days had made a sad change in him. With head bound in a bloody rag, and face of a waxy yellow hue, he staggered limply out of one of the rear rooms between Corson and Owens. "Brace up, me boy. You're worth 10 dead men," said the policeman encouragingly. "That's right. You'll be yourself in a jiffy." Barkhouse was soon propped up on the lounge in the guard-room, and with a few sips of whiskey and a fresh bandage, began to look like a more hopeful case. "'Twas a nasty cut," said one of the men sympathetically. "How did you get it?" I asked. "I don't rightly know," said Barkhouse faintly. "'Twas the night you went to Mother Borton's last week. After I leaves you, I walks down a piece towards the bay, and as I gets about to Drum Street, I guess, a fellow comes along as I takes to be a sailor half loaded. 'Hello, mate,' he says, a tryin' to steady himself. 'What time did you say it was?' I didn't say, says I, for I was too fly to take out my watch, even if it is a nickel-plater, for how could he tell what it was in the dark? And it's good for a dozen drinks at any waterfront saloon. 'Well, what do you make it?' he says. And as I was trying to reckon whether it was nearer 12 or 1 o'clock, he lurches up agin me and grabs my arms as if to steady himself. Then 3 or 4 fellows jumps from behind a lot of packing boxes there and grabs me. I makes a fight for it and gives one yell, and the next I knows I was in a dark room here with the sorest head in San Francisco. And I reckon I've been here about 6 days, and another would have finished me." Barkhouse's 6 days estimate provoked a smile. "If you could get paid on your time reckoning," remarked Owens in a humorous tone, "you'd be well off, Bob. 'Twas night before last you got took in." Barkhouse looked incredulous, but I nodded my support of Owens's remarkable statement. "However, you'll be paid on your own reckoning, and better, too," I said, and he was thereby consoled. "Now, we must get out of here," I continued. "Take turns by twos in helping Barkhouse. We had better not risk staying here." "Right," said Corson. "And now we'll just take these 3 beauties along to the station." "On what charge?" growled the man addressed as Conn. "Disturbing the peace. You've disturbed ours for sure. Resisting an officer. Vulgar language. Keeping a disorderly house. Carrying a pistol without a permit. And anything else I can think up between here and the station house. If that doesn't satisfy you, I'll put you down for assault and robbery on Barkhouse's story, and you may look for a charge of murder before you get out." The men swore at this cheerful prospect, but as their hands were bound behind them, and Corson walked with his club in one hand and his pistol in the other, they took up the march at command, and the rest of us slowly followed. End of chapter 27. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 28 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 28. The Chase in the Storm. When we reached the entrance to our quarters on Montgomery Street, the rain had once more begun to fall, gently now, but the gusts of damp wind from the south promised more and worse to follow. "Hello!" cried the first man, starting back. "What's this?" The line stopped, and I moved forward. "What is it?" I asked. "A message for you, Mr. Wilton," said a voice suddenly from the recess of the doorway. "Give it to me," I said. A slip of paper was thrust into my hand, and I passed up the stairs. "I'll wait for you," said the messenger, and at the first gas jet that burned at the head of the stairs I stopped to read the address. It was in the hand of the unknown, and my fatigue and indifference were gone in a moment. I trembled as I tore open the envelope and read: "Follow the bearer of this note at 12:30. Come alone and armed. It is important." There was no signature. If this meant anything, it meant that I was to meet the unknown, and perhaps to search the heart of the mystery. I had been heavy with fatigue and drowsy with want of sleep, but at this thought the energies of life were once more fresh within me. With my new-found knowledge it might be more important than even the unknown was aware, that we should meet. To me the map, the absence of Darby Meeker and his men, the mysterious hints of murder and death that had come from the lips of Mother Borton, were but vaguely suggestive. But to the unknown, with her full knowledge of the objects sought by the enemy and the motives that animated their ceaseless pursuit, the darkness might be luminous, the obscurity clear. The men had waited a minute for me as I read the note. "Go to your rooms and get some rest," I said. "I am called away. Trent will be in charge, and I will send word to him if I need any of you." They looked at me in blank protest. "You're not going alone, sir?" cried Owens in a tone of alarm. "Oh, no, but I shall not need a guard." I hoped heartily that I did not. The men shook their heads doubtfully, and I continued: "Corson will be down from the Central Station in 15 or 20 minutes. Just tell him that I've been sent for, and to come tomorrow if he can make it in his way." And bidding them good night, I ran hastily down the stairs before any of the men could frame his protest into words. "Are you ready, sir?" asked the messenger. "It is close on 12:30, I answered. "Where is she?" "It's not far," said my guide evasively. I understood the danger of speech, and did not press for an answer. We plunged down Montgomery Street in the teeth of the wind that dashed the spray in our faces at one moment, lulled an instant the better to deceive the unwary, and then leaped at us from behind corners with the impetuous rush of some great animal that turned to vapor as it reached us. The street was dark except for the newspaper offices, which glowed bright with lights on both sides of the way, busy with the only signs of life that the storm and the midnight hour had left. With the lighted buildings behind us we turned down California Street. Halfway down the block, in front of the Merchants' Exchange, stood a hack. At the sight my heart beat fast and my breath came quick. Here, perhaps, was the person about whom centered so many of my hopes and fears, in whose service I had faced death, and whose words might serve to make plain the secret springs of the mystery. As we neared the hack, my guide gave a short, suppressed whistle, and passing before me, flung open the door to the vehicle and motioned me to enter. I glanced about with some lack of confidence oppressing my spirits. But I had gone too far to retreat, and stepped into the hack. Instead of following, the guide closed the door gently. I heard him mount the seat by the driver, and in a moment we were in motion. Was I alone? I had expected to find the unknown, but the dark interior gave no sign of a companion. Then the magnetic suggestion of the presence of another came to my spirit, and a faint perfume put all my senses on the alert. It was the scent that had come to me with the letters of the unknown. A slight movement made me certain that someone sat in the farther corner of the carriage. Was it the unknown or some agent? And if it proved to be the unknown, was she the lady I had met in cold business greeting in the courtyard of the Palace Hotel? I waited impatiently for the first street lamp to throw a gleam of light into the carriage, but when it came I was little the wiser. I could see faintly the outlines of a figure shrouded in black that leaned in the corner, motionless save for the swaying and pitching of the hack as it rolled swiftly down the street. The situation became a little embarrassing. Was it my place to speak first, I wondered? At last I could endure the silence no longer. "Quite an unpleasant evening," I remarked politely. There was a rustle of movement, the sound of a short gasp, and a soft, mournful voice broke in my ear. "Mr. Dudley, can you forgive me?" The astonishment I felt to hear my own name once more, the name that seemed now to belong to a former state of existence, was swallowed up as the magnetic tones carried their revelation to my mind. I was stricken dumb for a moment at the discovery they had brought. Then I gasped: "Mrs. Knapp!" "Yes, Mrs. Knapp," she said with a mournful laugh. "Did you never suspect?" I was lost in wonder and confusion, and even yet could not understand. "What brings you out in this storm?" I asked, completely mystified. "I thought I was to meet another person." "Indeed?" said Mrs. Knapp with a spark of animation. "Well, I am the other person." I was paralyzed in mind and nerve for a moment with the astonishment of the disclosure. Even yet I could not believe. "You!" I exclaimed at last. "Are you the protector of the boy? The employer—" Then I stopped, the tangle in my mind beginning to straighten out. "I am she," said Mrs. Knapp gently. "Then," I cried, "who is he? What is he? What is the whole dreadful affair about? And what—" Mrs. Knapp interrupted me. "First tell me what has become of Henry Wilton," she said with sorrow in her voice. The dreadful scene in the alley flashed before my mind. "He is dead." "Dead! And how?" "Murdered." "I feared so. I was certain, or he would have let me know. You have much to tell me. But first, did he leave no papers in your hands?" I brought out the slip that bore the blind diagram and the blinder description that accompanied it. Nothing could be made of it in the darkness, so I described it as well as I could. "We are on the right track," said Mrs. Knapp. "Oh, why didn't I have that yesterday? But here, we are at the wharf." The hack had stopped, and a hand was fumbling at the door. The darkness, the dash of water, the wind whistling about the crazy wooden buildings and through the rigging of ships, made the waterfront vocal with the shouting of the storm demons as we alighted. My guide was before us, and we followed him down the pier, struggling against the gusts. "Do we cross the bay?" I asked, as Mrs. Knapp clung to my arm. "It's not safe for you in a small boat." "There's a tug waiting for us," Mrs. Knapp explained. A moment later we saw its lights, and the fire of its engine room shot a cheerful glow into the storm. The little vessel swung uneasily at its berth as we made our way aboard, and with shouts of men and clang of bells it was soon tossing on the dark waters of the bay. Out from the shelter of the wharves the wind buffeted us wildly, and the black waves were threshed into phosphorescent foam against the sides of the tug, while their crests, self-luminous, stretched away in changing lines of faint, ghostly fire. The cabin of the tug was fitted with a shelf table, and over it swung a lamp of brass that gave a dim light to the little room. Mrs. Knapp seated herself here, as the boat pitched and tossed and trembled at the strokes of the waves and quivered to the throbbing of the screw, spread out the paper I had given her, and studied the diagram and the jumble of letters with anxious attention. "It is the same," she said at last. "In part, at least." "The same as what?" I asked. "As the one I got word of tonight, you know," she replied. "No, I didn't know." "Of course not," said Mrs. Knapp. "But you might have guessed that I got my summons after you left, this evening. I should have spoken to you then if I had known. I was near coming to an explanation as it was." "There are a good many things I haven't guessed," I confessed. "But," she continued, returning to the map, "this gives a different place. I was to go to the crossroad here," indicating the mark at the last branch. "I'm glad to hear that," said I, taking out the diagram I had found in the citadel of the enemy. "This seems to point to a different place, too, and I really hope that the gentleman who drew this map is a good way off from the truth." "Where did you get this?" exclaimed Mrs. Knapp. I described the circumstances in as few words as I could command. "They are ahead of us," she said in alarm. "They have started first, I suppose," was my suggestion. "And they have the right road." "Then our only hope is that they may not know the right place." "God grant it," said Mrs. Knapp. She was silent for a few minutes, and I saw that her eyes were filled with tears. I was moved by her signs of feeling. I thought they were for the boy, and was about to ask what would happen to him in case he was found by the enemy, when she said: "Now tell me about Henry Wilton, how he died, and when." Again the vision of my first dreadful night in San Francisco rose before me. The cries for help from my murdered friend rang in my ears, and the scene in the alley and the figure in the morgue burned before my eyes. I told the tale as it had happened, and as I told it, I read in the face before me the varying emotions of alarm, horror, and grief that were stirred by its incidents. But one thing I could not tell her. The wolf face I had seen in the lantern flash in the alley I could not name nor describe to the wife of Doddridge Knapp. Yet at the thought the dark mystery grew darker yet, and I began to doubt what my eyes had seen and my ears had heard. Mrs. Knapp bowed her head in deep, gloomy thought. "I feared it, yet he would not listen to my warnings," she murmured. "He would work his own way." Then she looked me suddenly straight in the face. "And why did you take his place, his name? Why did you try to do his work when you had seen the dreadful end to which it had brought him?" I confessed that it was half through the insistence of Detective Coogan that I was Henry Wilton, half through the course of events that seemed to make it the easiest road to reach the vengeance that I had vowed to bring the murderer of my friend. "Are you bent on avenging him?" asked Mrs. Knapp thoughtfully. "I have promised it." "You shall have the chance. Strange thought," she said gloomily, "that the dead hand of Henry Wilton may reach out from beyond the grave and strike at his slayer when he least expects it." I was more than ever mystified at these words. I had not expected her to take so philosophically to the idea of hanging Doddridge Knapp, and I thought it best to hold my tongue. "I have marveled at you," said Mrs. Knapp after a pause. "I marvel at you yet. You have carried off your part well." "Not well enough, it seems, to deceive you," I said, a little bitterly. "You should not have expected to deceive me," said Mrs. Knapp. "But you can imagine the shock I had when I saw that it was not Henry Wilton who had come among us that first night when I called you from Mr. Knapp's room." "You certainly succeeded in concealing any surprise you may have felt," I said. "You are a better actor than I." Mrs. Knapp smiled. "It was more than surprise, it was consternation," she said. "I had been anxious at receiving no word from Henry. I suppose you got my notes. And when I saw you I was torn with doubts, wondering whether anything had happened to Henry, whether he had sent you in his stead as a practical joke, whether you knew much or little or nothing of our affairs. In short, I was overwhelmed." "I didn't suppose I was quite so poor an impostor," I said apologetically, with a qualm at the word. "Though I did get some hint of it," I added, with a painful recollection of the candid statement of opinion I had received from the daughter of the house. "Oh, you did very well," said Mrs. Knapp kindly, "but no one could have been successful in that house. Luella was quite outraged over it, but I managed to quiet her." "I hope Miss Knapp has not retained the unfavorable impressions of I stammered in much confusion. Mrs. Knapp gave me a keen glance. "You know she has not," she said. I felt a subconscious impression somehow that after all Mrs. Knapp would have been better pleased if Luella had kept nearer to her first impressions of me. "Well," continued Mrs. Knapp, "when I saw you and guessed that something had happened to Henry Wilton, and found that you knew little of what was going on, I changed the plan of campaign. I did not know that you were one to be trusted, but I saw that you could be used to keep the others on a false scent, for you deceived everybody but us." "There was one other," I said. "Mother Borton?" inquired Mrs. Knapp. "Yes, I learned that she knew you. But to everyone else in the city you were Henry Wilton. I feared, though, you would make some mistake that would betray you and spoil my plans. But you have succeeded marvelously." Mrs. Knapp paused a moment, and then continued slowly: "It was cruel of me. I knew that it was sending you to face death. But I was alarmed, angry at the imposition, and felt that you had brought it on yourself. Can you forgive me?" "I have nothing to forgive," I said. "I would have spoken when I found you for what you are," said Mrs. Knapp. "But I thought until the Livermore trip that you could serve me best as you were doing." "It was blind work," I said. "It was blind enough for you, not for me. I was deceived in one thing, however. I thought that you had no papers, nothing from Henry that could help or hurt. The first night you came to us I had Henry's room thoroughly searched." "Oh, I was indebted to you for that attention," I exclaimed. "I gave our friends of the other house the credit." Mrs. Knapp smiled again. "I thought it necessary. It was the chance that you did not sleep there that night that kept this paper out of my hands weeks ago." "I have always kept it with me," I said. "I did not need it till Sunday," continued Mrs. Knapp. "I have been worried much at the situation of the boy, but I did not dare go near him.
Henry and I decided that his hiding place was not safe. We had talked of moving him a few days before you came. When I found that Henry had disappeared, I was anxious to make the change, but I could not venture to attempt it until the others were out of town, for I knew I was watched. Then I was assured from Mother Borton that they did not know where the boy was hidden, and I let the matter rest. But a few days ago, on Saturday, she sent me word that she thought they had found the place. Then it came to me to send you to Livermore with the other boy. Oh, I hope no harm came to this little fellow," she exclaimed anxiously. "He's safe at my rooms in charge of Wainwright," I said. "He got back on the morning train, and can be had for the asking." "Oh, I'm so glad," said Mrs. Knapp. "I was afraid something would happen to him, but I had to take desperate chances. Well, you see my plan succeeded. They all followed you. But when I went to the hiding place, the boy was gone. Henry had moved him weeks ago, and had died before he could tell me. Then I thought you might know more than you had told me, that Henry Wilton might have got you to help him when he made the change, and I wrote to you." "And the key," I said, remembering the expression of the note. "Did you mean this diagram?" "No," said Mrs. Knapp. "I meant the key to our cipher code. I was looking over Henry's letters for some hint of a hiding place, and could not find the key to the cipher. I thought you might have been given one. I found mine this afternoon, though, and there was no need of it, so it didn't matter after all." The pitching and tossing of the boat had ceased for some minutes, and at this point the captain of the tug opened the cabin. "Excuse me," he said apologetically, uncertain whether to address Mrs. Knapp or me, and including us both in the question, "but where did you want to land?" "At Broadway," said Mrs. Knapp. "Then you're there," said the captain. And a minute later, with clang of bells and groan of engine, we were at the wharf and were helped ashore. On this side of the bay the wind had fallen, and there were signs of a break in the clouds. The darkness of the hour was dimly broken by the rays from the lines of street lamps that stretched at intervals on both sides of Broadway, making the gloom of the place and hour even more oppressive. "Tell the captain to wait here for us with fires up," said Mrs. Knapp. "The carriage should be somewhere around here," she continued, peering anxiously about as we reached the foot of the wharf. The low buildings by the railroad track were but piles of blackness, and about them I could see nothing. "This way," said a familiar voice, and a man stepped from the shadow. "Dicky Nahl!" I exclaimed. "Mr. Wilton," mimicked Dicky. "But it's just as well not to speak so loud. Here you are. I put the hack's lights out just to escape unpleasant remark. We had better be moving, for it's a stiffish drive of 6 or 7 miles. If you'll get in, I'll keep the seat with the driver and tell him the way to go." Mrs. Knapp entered the carriage and called to me to follow her. I remembered Mother Borton's warnings and my doubts of Dicky Nahl. "You're certain you know where you're going?" I asked him in an undertone. "No, I'm not," said Dicky frankly. "I've found a man who says he knows. We are to meet him. We'll get there between 3 and 4 o'clock. He won't say another word to anybody but her or you. I guess he knows what he is about." "Well, keep your eyes open. Meeker's gang is ahead of us. Is the driver reliable?" "Right as a judge," said Dicky cheerfully. "Now, if you'll get in with Madam, we won't be wasting time here." I stepped into the carriage.
Dicky Nahl closed the door softly and climbed on the seat by the driver, and in a moment we were rolling up Broadway in the gloomy stillness of the early morning hour. End of chapter 28. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 29 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 29. The Heart of the Mystery. In the tumult of conflicting thoughts that assailed me as we entered on the last stage of our journey, the idea of the perils that might lie ahead fixed my attention for the moment, and I began to feel alarm for the safety of my companion. "Mrs. Knapp," I said, "there is no need for you to take this journey. You had better stop in Oakland for the rest of the night." "I must go," she replied. "There is danger," I argued. "You should not expose yourself to the chances of a brush with the enemy. It is a wet, cold ride, and there may be bullets flying at the end of it." Mrs. Knapp gave a shudder, but she spoke firmly. "I could not rest. I could not stay away. It may be important that I should be there. It will be important if we find the boy. You do not know him. Mr. Nahl does not know him." "None of my men seem to know him," I interrupted. "That is, if anyone may judge by the way they were all taken in on the boy you sent to Livermore." "I think none of them ever saw his face, though some of them were with Henry Wilton when he first took the boy, and afterward." "The enemy seem to know him," said I, remembering the scene at Livermore. "Terrill knows him, but I think none of the other agents could be certain of his face, unless it is Mr. Meeker. But truly I must go." "You are very brave," I said, admiring her spirit, though I was loath to have the responsibility of her safety on my hands. "Without you I should not dare to go, I fear," she made answer. "I need a strong arm to lean on, you see." "You may wish later that you had chosen a cavalier with 2 strong arms to his equipment. I fear I shouldn't do so well in a hand-to-hand encounter as I should have done before I met Mr. Terrill last night." "Oh, I hope it will not come to that," said Mrs. Knapp cheerfully, though there was a little tremor in her voice. "What if they have seized the boy?" Mrs. Knapp was silent for a little, as if this contingency had not entered her plans. "We must follow him and save him, even if we have to raise the whole county to do it." Her voice was firm and resolute. "What would happen to the boy if he were taken?" I found courage to ask. "He would not live a month," she replied. "Would he be murdered?" "I don't know how the end would come, but I know he would die." I was in the shadow of the mystery. 100 questions rose to my lips, but behind them all frowned the grim wolf visage of Doddridge Knapp, and I could not find the courage that could make me speak to them. "Mrs. Knapp," I said, "you have called me by my name. I had almost forgotten that I had ever borne it. I have lived more in the last month than in the 25 years that I remember before it, and I have almost come to think that the old name belongs to someone else. May I ask how you got hold of it?" "It was simple enough. Henry had told me about you. I remembered that you were coming from the same town he had come from. I telegraphed to an agent in Boston. He went up to your place, made his inquiries and telegraphed me. I suppose you will be pleased to know," she continued with a droll affectation of malice in her voice, "that he mailed me your full history as gathered from the town pump. It is at the house now." "I trust it is nothing so very disreputable," I said modestly, raking my memory hastily for any likely account of youthful escapades. "There was one rather serious bit," said Mrs. Knapp gravely. "There was an orchard There was more than one, I admitted. Mrs. Knapp broke into a laugh. I might have expected it. I knew the account was too good to be true. You'll have to get Luella's permission if you want to read the charges in full, though. She has taken possession of the document. Luella knew. At first I was disappointed, then relieved. Something of the promised explanation was taken off my mind. I tried to get something out of Mother Borton concerning you, continued Mrs. Knapp. I even went so far as to see her once. I don't think you got any more out of her than she wanted to tell. Indeed, I did not. I was afraid Mr. Richmond had not gone about it the right way. You know Mr. Richmond acted as my agent with her. No, I didn't know. She was as close-mouthed with me as with you, I think. Well, I saw her. I wanted to get what information she had of you and of Henry. She had a good deal of it, if she wanted to give it up. So I supposed. But she was too clever for me. She spoke well of you, but not a word could I get from her about Henry. Yet she gave me the idea that she knew much. I should think she might. I had told her the whole story. She is a strange woman. She was able to hold her tongue. A strange gift, you mean to say, I suppose, laughed Mrs. Knapp. She was quite as successful in concealing from me the fact that she had ever had word with you, though I suspected that she knew more than she told. She is used to keeping secrets, I suppose, replied Mrs. Knapp. But I must reward her well for what she has done. She is beyond fear or reward. Dead? Cried Mrs. Knapp in a shocked voice. And how? She died, I fear, because she befriended me. And then I told her the story of Mother Borton's end. Poor creature, said Mrs. Knapp sadly. Yet perhaps it is better so. She has died in doing a good act. She was a good friend to me, I said. I should have been in the morgue before her, I fear, but for her good will. Mrs. Knapp was silent for a minute. I hope we are at the end of the tale of death, she said at last. It is dreadful that insane greed and malice should spread their evil so far about. 2 lives have been sacrificed already, and perhaps it is only the beginning. Yet I believe, I am sure, I have done right. I am sure of that, I said, and then was silent as her words called up the image of the wolf, dark, forbidding, glowing with the fires of hate, the wolf of the lantern flash in the alley and the dens of Chinatown, and the mystery seemed deeper than ever. The carriage had been rolling along swiftly. Despite the rain, the streets were smooth and hard, and we made rapid progress. We had crossed a bridge and with many turns made a course toward the southeast. Now the ground became softer, and progress was slow. An interminable array of trees lined the way on both sides, and to my impatient imagination stretched for miles before us. Then the road became better, and the horses trotted briskly forward again, their hoofs pattering dully on the softened ground. All the better, I thought. It's as good as a muffler if anyone is listening for us. Here's the place, came the voice of Dicky, giving directions to the driver, and the carriage slackened pace and stopped. Looking out, I saw that we were at a division of the road where a 2-story house faced both of the branching ways. You'd better come out, said Dicky at the door, addressing his remark to me. He was to meet us here. Be careful, cautioned Mrs. Knapp. The night had turned colder, or I was chilled by the inaction of the ride. The sky was clearing, and stars were to be seen. By the outline of the hills we had made to the south, The horses steamed and breathed heavily in the keen air. I kept my hand on the revolver that lay in my overcoat pocket, and walked with Dicky onto the porch. It was a common roadside saloon, and at this hour it appeared wholly deserted. Even the dog, without which I knew no roadside saloon could exist, was as silent as its owners. "Here's a go," said Dicky. "He was to meet us, sure. What time have you got?" I struck a match in a corner and looked at my watch by its flare. 5 minutes to 3. "Whew!" he whispered. "We're regularly done. I thought he had a bad eye when I was bargaining with him." I wondered if Dicky had a hand in the trick, if trick it should prove to be. "He may be upstairs," I suggested. Dicky groaned. "It's like advertising with a bandwagon to rout him out at this time of the night," he whispered. "The enemy have been along here ahead of us," I said. "They may have picked him up." "That's like enough," said Dicky ruefully. "But if they've got him, we might as well take the back tracks for town and hunt up a sheriff or two, or send for the boys to come over." "It's too late to do that," said I decidedly. "We must go on at once." "Well," said Dicky dubiously, "I think I know where the fellow would have taken us. I trailed him this afternoon, and I'll lay 2 to 1 that I can pick out the right road." "Is this the third road from Brooklyn?" I asked, pointing to the track that led to the left. "I reckon so," said Dicky. "I haven't kept count, but I recollect only 2 before it." "All right. Up with you, then." Dicky obediently mounted to the seat beside the driver. "I shall ride outside," I said to Mrs. Knapp. "I may be needed." "I suppose you are right," she replied with somewhat of protest in her voice. And I closed the door and climbed up. It was close quarters for 3, but at the word the horses, refreshed by the brief rest, rolled the carriage up the road that led to the hills. Half a mile farther we passed a house, and within 1/4 of a mile another. "We are on the right road," was my thought as I compared these in my mind with the crosses on the diagram. About half a mile farther a small cluster of buildings loomed up, dark and obscure, by the roadside. "This is the place," I said confidently, motioning the driver to pull up. I remembered that Henry Wilton's map had stopped at the 3rd cross from the parting of the roads. "No, it isn't," said Dicky eagerly. "It's 2 or 3 miles farther on. I trailed the fellow myself to the next house, and that's a good 2 miles at least." I had leaped to the ground and opened the door of the carriage. "We are at the 4th place," I said. "And the cockeyed barn?" inquired Mrs. Knapp, peering out. I was struck silent by this, and looked blankly at the dark forbidding structure that fronted on the road. "You're right," said Mrs. Knapp, with a laugh. "Can't you make out that funny little window at the end there?" I looked more closely at the building. In the dim light of the stars, the coat of whitewash that covered it made it possible to trace the outlines of a window in the gable that fronted the road. Some freak of the builder had turned it 1/4 of the way around, giving it a comical suggestion of a man with a droop to his eye. "And the iron cow?" I asked. "Stupid! A pump, of course," replied Mrs. Knapp with another laugh. "Now see if there is a lane here by the barn." A narrow roadway, just wide enough for a single wagon, joined the main road at the corner of the building. "Then drive up it quietly," was Mrs. Knapp's direction. Just beyond the barn I made out the figure of the pump in a conspicuous place by the roadside, and felt more confident that we were on the right road. The lane was now wrapped in Egyptian darkness. Trees lined both sides of the narrow way. Their branches brushed our faces as we passed, and their tops seemed to meet above us till even the faint light of the stars scarcely glimmered through. The hoofs of the horses splashed in the mud, and the rather clumsy carriage dragged heavily and slowly forward. "I'd give $5 to light my lamps," growled the driver. We were traveling by the instinct of the horses. "If your life is worth more than $5, you'd better keep them dark," I said. The driver swore in an undertone as the hack lurched and groaned in a boggy series of ruts, and a branch whipped him in the face. I was forced to give a grunt myself, as another slapped my sore arm and sent a sharp twinge of pain shooting from the wound till it tingled in my toes. Dicky, protected between us, chuckled softly. I reflected savagely that nothing spoils a man for company like a mistaken sense of humor. Suddenly the horses stopped so short that we were almost pitched out. "Hullo, what's this?" I cried, drawing my revolver, fearful of an ambush. "It's a fence," said the driver. "There must be a gate," I said, jumping down quickly. Mrs. Knapp rapped on the carriage door, and I opened it. "Have you come to the bars?" she asked presently. "I guess so. We've come against something like a fence." "Well, then," she replied, "when we get through, take the road to the left. That will bring us to the house." "You are certain?" "That is what Henry wrote in the cipher beneath the map. The house must be only a few hundred yards away." The bars were there, and I lifted the wet and soggy boards with an anxious heart. Were we, after all, so near the hiding place? And what were we to find? I mounted the seat again, and we drove forward. The road was scarcely distinguishable, but the horses followed it without hesitation, as it led behind a tall hedge and among scattered oaks. My heart beat fast. What if the enemy were before us? "Have you got your revolver handy?" I whispered to Dicky. "Two of them," he chuckled. "There's a double dose for the man that wants it." On a sudden turn the house loomed up before us, and a wild clamor of dogs broke the stillness of the night. "I hope they are tied," I said, with a poor attempt to conceal my misgivings. "We'll have a lively time in a quarter of a minute if they aren't," laughed Dicky as he followed me. But the baying and barking came no nearer, and I helped Mrs. Knapp out of the carriage. She looked at the house closely. "This is the place," she said in an unmistakable tone of decision. "We must be quick. I wish something would quiet those dogs. They will bring the whole country out." It seemed an hour before we could raise anyone, but it may not have been 3 minutes before a voice came from behind the door. "Who's there?" "It's L.M.K.," said Mrs. Knapp. Then she added 3 words of gibberish that I took to be the passwords used to identify the friends of the boy. At the words there was the sound of bolts shooting back, and the heavy door opened enough to admit us. As we passed in, it was closed once more and the bolts shot home. Before us stood a short, heavy-set man, holding a candle. His face, which was stamped with much of the bulldog look in it, was smooth-shaven except for a bristling brown mustache. He looked inquiringly at us. "Is he here, the boy?" cried Mrs. Knapp, her voice choked with anxiety. "Yes," said the man. "Do we move again?" He seemed to feel no surprise at the situation, and I inferred that it was not the first time he had changed quarters, on a sudden, at the darkest hour of the night. "At once," said Mrs. Knapp, in her tone of decision. "It will take 10 minutes to get ready," said the man. "Come this way." I was left standing alone by the door in the darkness, with a burden lifted from my mind. We had come in time. The single slip of paper left by Henry Wilton had been the means, through a strange combination of events, to point the way to the unknown hiding place of the boy. He was still safe, and the enemy were on a false trail. I should not have to reproach myself with the sacrifice of the child. Yet my mind was far from easy. The enemy might have been misled, but if they had followed the road marked out in the diagram I had brought from their den, they were too close for comfort. I listened for any sounds from the outside. The dogs had quieted down. Twice I thought I heard hoofbeats, and there was a chorus of barks from the rear of the house. But it was only the horses that had brought us hither, stamping impatiently as they waited. In a few minutes the wavering light of the candle reappeared. Mrs. Knapp was carrying a bundle that I took to be the boy, and the man brought a valise and a blanket. "It's all right," said Mrs. Knapp. "No, I can carry him. I want to carry him." The man opened the door, then closed and locked it as I helped Mrs. Knapp into the carriage. "Have you got him safe?" asked Dicky incredulously. "Well, I'll have to say that you know more than I thought you did." And the relief and satisfaction in his tone were so evident that I gladly repented of my suspicions of the light-hearted Dicky. "Have you heard anything?" I asked him anxiously. "I thought I heard a yell over here through the woods. We had better get out of here." "Don't wait a second," said the man. "The south road comes over this other way. If you've heard anybody there, they will be here in 5 minutes. I'll follow you on a horse." With an injunction to haste, I stepped after Mrs. Knapp into the carriage, the door was shut, Dicky mounted the seat, and we rolled down the road on the return journey. "Oh, how thankful I am!" cried Mrs. Knapp. "There is a weight of anxiety off my mind. Can you imagine what I have been fearing in the last month?" "I had thought a little about that myself," I confessed. "But we are not yet out of the woods, I am afraid." "Hark! What's that?" said Mrs. Knapp apprehensively. The carriage was now making its way through the bad stretch in the lane, and there was little noise in its progress. "I heard nothing," I said, putting down the window to listen. "What was it?" "I thought it was a shout." There was no noise but the steady splash of horses' hoofs in the mud, and the sloppy shearing sound of the wheels as they cut through the wet soil. As we bumped and groaned again through the ruts, however, there arose in the distance behind us the fierce barking of dogs, their voices raised in anger and alarm. There was a faint halloo, and a wilder barking followed. Then my ear caught the splashing of galloping hoofs behind, and in a moment the man of the house rode beside us. "They've come," he said. "Or, anyhow, somebody's come. I let the dogs loose, and they will have a lively time for a while." At his words there was another chorus of barks and shouts. Then a shot rang out, and a fusillade followed with a mournful wail that died away into silence. "Good Lord, they've shot the dogs!" cried the man hotly. "I've a mind to go back and pepper some of 'em." "No," said Mrs. Knapp. "We may need you. Let us hurry." A few yards more brought us to the main road, and once on the firm ground the horses trotted briskly forward, while the horsemen dropped behind, the better to observe and give the alarm. "We were just in time," said Mrs. Knapp, trembling. "Let us be thankful for so much," said I cheerfully. "They will follow us," said Mrs. Knapp, with conviction in her tone. "Not before they have broken into the house. That will keep them for some time, I think."
"Is there no sign of pursuit?"
I leaned out of the window. Only the deadened sound of the hoofs of our own horses, the deadened roll of our own carriage wheels, were audible in the stillness of the night. Then I thought I heard yells and faint hoofbeats in the distance. But again there was silence except for the muffled noise we made in our progress.
"Can't we drive faster?"
asked Mrs. Knapp when I made my report.
"I wouldn't spoil these horses for $500," growled the driver when I passed him the injunction to hasten. "It's $1,000 for you, if you get to the wharf ahead of the others," cried Mrs. Knapp. "And you'll have a bullet in your hide if you don't keep out of gunshot of them," I added. The double inducement to haste had its effect, and we could feel the swifter motion of the vehicle under us, and see the more rapid passage of the trees and fences that lined the way. The wild ride appeared to last for ages. The fast trot of the horses was a funeral pace to the flight of my excited and anxious imagination. What if we should be overtaken? The hack would offer no protection from bullets, and Mrs. Knapp and the boy could scarcely escape injury if it came to a close encounter. But whenever I looked back there was only the single horseman galloping behind us, and the only sound to be heard was that of our own progress. At last the houses began to pass more frequently. Now the road was broken by cross streets. Gas lamps appeared, flickering faint and yellow in the morning air, as though the long night vigil had robbed them of their vitality. We were once more within city limits, and I felt a loosening of the tense nerves of anxiety. The panting horses never slackened pace. We swept over a long bridge and plunged down a shaded street, and the figure of the horseman was the only sign of life behind us. Of a sudden there sounded a long roll, as of a great drum beating the reveille for an army of giants. The horseman quickened his pace and galloped furiously beside us. "They're crossing the bridge," he shouted. "Whip up," I cried to the driver. "They are only 4 blocks behind us." "Are they in sight?" asked Mrs. Knapp. "I cannot see them," I replied, "and it may not be the ones we fear. It is near daybreak, and we are not the only ones astir." I peered out, but a rising mist from the lagoon and the bay hindered the vision, and the sound of the rolling drum had ceased. The hack swung around a few corners, and then halted. "Here we are," cried Dicky Nahl at the door. "You get aboard the tug and push off. Jake and I will run up to the foot of the wharf. If they come, we can keep 'em off long enough for you to get aboard." Dicky had a revolver in each hand, and the determined ring of his voice, so different from his usual light bantering tone, gave me assurance of his sincerity. With the horseman he hastened to the entrance of the wharf, where the two loomed through the mist like shadow men. The tug was where it lay when we left, and at my hail the captain and his crew of 3 were astir. It was a moment's work to get Mrs. Knapp and her charge aboard. "Come on!" I cried to Dicky and his companion; and as the lines were cast off they made a running jump on to the deck of the tugboat, and the vessel backed out into the stream. As the wharf faded away into the mist that hung over the waters, I thought I saw shapes of men and horses rushing frantically to the edge, and a massive figure waving its arms like a madman and shouting impotent curses into the air. But with the distance, the uncertain light, and the curtain of mist that was thickening between us, my eyes might have deceived me, and I omitted to mention my suspicions to Mrs. Knapp. When the mist and darkness had blotted out shore, wharves and shipping, the tug moved at half speed down the channel.
I persuaded the captain that there was no need to sound the whistle, but he declined gruffly to increase his speed. "I might as well be shot as run my boat ashore," he growled, with a few emphatic seaman-like adjectives that appeared to belong to nothing in particular. "And anyone that doesn't like my way of running a boat can get out and walk." I did not know of any particular reason for arguing the question, so I joined Mrs. Knapp. "Thank God, we are safe," she said, with a sigh of relief. "We shall be in the city in half an hour, if that is safety," I said. "It will be safety for a few days. Then we can devise a new plan. I have a strong arm to lean on again." "I think if you would tell me who the boy is, and why the danger threatens him, I might help you more wisely." "Perhaps you are right," said Mrs. Knapp thoughtfully. "You shall know before it is necessary to make our next plans." And then the boy called for her attention, and I returned to the deck. The light of the morning was growing. Vessels were moving. The whistles of the ferry boats, as they gave warning of their way through the mist, rose shrill on the air. The waters were still, a faint ripple showing in strange contrast to the scene of last night. "There's a steamer behind us," said Dicky Nahl, with a worried look as I joined him. "I've been listening to it for 5 minutes." "It's a tug," said the captain. "She was lying on the other side of the wharf last night." "Good heavens!" I cried. "Put on full steam, then, or we shall be run down in the bay. It's the gang we are trying to get away from." The captain looked at me suspiciously for a moment, and was inclined to resent my interference. Then he shrugged his shoulders as though it was none of his business whether we were lunatics or not, so long as we paid for the privilege, and rang the engine bell for full speed ahead. We had just come out of the Oakland Creek channel, and the mist suddenly thinned before us. It left the bay and the city fair and wholesome in the gray light, as though the storm had washed the grime and foulness from air and earth and renewed the freshness of life. The clear outline of the hills was scarcely broken by smoke. The ever-changing beauties of the most beautiful of bays took on the faint suggestion of a livelier tint, the herald of the coming sun. We had come but a few hundred yards into the clear air when out of the mist bank behind us shot another tug, the smoke streaming from the funnel, the steam puffing noisily from the escapes and the engine straining to increase the speed. At the exclamation that broke from us, our captain for the first time showed interest in the speed of his boat and whistled angrily down to his engineer. "We can beat her," he said, with a contemptuous accent on the her. "That's your business," I returned, and walked aft to where Mrs. Knapp was standing, halfway up the steps from the cabin. "There is Darby Meeker," I said, getting sight of him on the pursuing tug. "Can they catch us?" inquired Mrs. Knapp, the lines tightening about her mouth. "I think not. The captain says not. I should say that we were holding our own now." At this moment a tall, massive figure stepped from the pilot-house of the pursuing tug and shook its fists at us. At the sight of the man my heart stood still. The huge bulk, the wolf face, just distinguishable, distorted, dark with rage and passion, stopped the blood, and I felt a faintness as of dropping from a height. With a gasp, life and voice came back to me. "Doddridge Knapp!" I cried. Mrs. Knapp looked at me in alarm, and grasped the rail. "No, no!" she exclaimed. "1,000 times no! That is Elijah Lane." I gazed at her in wonder. Not Doddridge Knapp? Had my eyes played me false? "Do you not understand?" she said in a low, intense tone. "He is Elijah Lane, the father of the boy. An evil, wicked man, mad, truly mad. He would kill the boy. He killed the mother of the boy. I know, but it is not a case for proof, not a case that the law can touch. And he hates the boy and me." I began to grasp the truth, and recovered speech. "But why does he want to kill him? And would not the law punish the crime?" "You do not understand. The boy inherits a great fortune from his mother. Mr. Knapp and I are left trustees by the mother's will. If he had control of the boy would die, but it would be from cruelty, disease, neglect. It would not be murder in the eye of the law. But I know what would happen. Oh, see the wretch! How he hates me!" I was stunned with the words I had heard. They made much plain that had puzzled me, yet they left much more in darkness, and I looked blankly at the figure on the other tug. It was truly a strange sight. The man was beside himself with rage, shouting, gesticulating, and leaping about the deck in transports of passion. He showed every mark of a maniac. Suddenly he drew a revolver and sent shot after shot in our direction. We were far beyond the reach of a pistol bullet, but Mrs. Knapp screamed and dodged. "How he hates me!" she cried again. When the last shot was gone from his revolver, the man flung the weapon in frenzy, as though he could hope to strike us thus. Then a strange thing happened. Whether due to the effort he had made in the throw, or to a lurch of the tug in the waves we left behind us, or to a stumble over some obstruction, I could not say. But we saw the man suddenly pitch forward over the low bulwarks of the tug into the waters of the bay. Mrs. Knapp gave a scream and covered her eyes. "Stop the boat!" I shouted. "Back her!" The other tug had checked its headway at the same time, and there was a line of 6 or 7 men along its side. "There he is!" cried one. The captain laid our tug across the tidal stream that swept us strongly toward Goat Island. Then he steamed slowly toward the other tug. "He's gone," said Dicky. The other tug seemed anxious to keep away from us, as in distrust of our good intentions. I scanned the waters carefully, but the drowning man had gone down. Then, rising not 20 feet away, floating for a moment on the surface of the water, I saw plainly for the first time the very caricature of the face of Doddridge Knapp. The strong wolf features which in the King of the Street were eloquent of power, intellect, and sagacity, were here marked with the record of passion, hatred, and evil life. I marveled now that I had never traced a likeness between them. "Give me that hook!" I cried, leaning over the side of the tug. "Go ahead a little." One of the men threw a rope. It passed too far and drifted swiftly behind. I made a wild reach with the hook, but it was too short. Just as I thought I should succeed, the face gave a convulsive twitch, as if in a parting outburst of hate and wrath, and the body sank out of sight. We waited for a few minutes, but there was no further sign. The other tug that had hovered near us turned about and made for the Oakland shore. I signed to the captain to take his course for the city. The men talked in subdued tones, and I stood half bewildered, with a bursting sense of relief, by Mrs. Knapp. At last she took her hands from before her eyes and the first rays of the sun that cleared the tops of the Alameda Hills touched her calm, solemn, hopeful face. "A new day has dawned," she said. "Let us give thanks to God." End of chapter 29. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 30 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 30. The End of the Journey. For a few minutes we were silent. Water and land and sky started into new glories at the touch of the rising sun. The many-hilled city looked on the hues of a fairy picture, and the windows gleamed with the magic fires that were flashed back in greeting to the god of day. The few cotton-ball clouds that lingered about the mountain-tops, sole stragglers of the army that had trooped up from the south at the blast of the rain-wind, turned from pink to white. The green-gray waters of the bay rippled lightly in the tide as the tug sent the miniature surges trailing in diverging lines from its bow. The curtain of mist that hid the Alameda shore rose and lightened at the touch of the warm rays. The white sails of the high-masted ships scattered through the bay drooped in graceful festoons as they turned to the sun to rid them of the rain-water that clung to their folds. The ferry-boats, moving with mock majesty, furnished the signs of life to the silent panorama. It seemed scarcely possible that this was the raging, tossing water we had crossed last night, and the fiery scene of passion and death we had just witnessed was so foreign to its calm beauties that I could believe it had happened elsewhere in some dream of long ago. I was roused by the voice of Mrs. Knapp, who sat at the head of the cabin stairs, looking absently over the water. "I have not dealt frankly with you," she said. "Perhaps it is better that you should know, as you know so much already. I feel that I may rely on your discretion." "I think I can keep a secret," I replied, concealing my curiosity. "I should not tell you if I did not have full confidence." Then she was silent for a minute. "That man," she continued at last, with a shudder in her voice, "that man was Mr. Knapp's brother." I suppressed an exclamation, and she continued: "They have little in common, even in looks. I wonder you thought for a moment that he was Mr. Knapp. Few people who know them both have traced a resemblance." "Perhaps those who do not know them would be more likely to find the common points," I suggested. "Members of a family see only the difference that marks one of them from another. The stranger at first sees the family type in all and notes the differences later." "Yes," said Mrs. Knapp. "It's like picking out the Chinamen. At first they are all alike. We see only the race type. Afterward we see the many and marked differences." "I think," said I, leading back to the main subject, "that the remarkable circumstances under which I had seen Mr. Lane had a good deal to do with the illusion. This morning, for the first time, I saw his face under full light and close at hand." Mrs. Knapp nodded. Then she continued: "Mr. Knapp and his brother parted 30 years ago, in Ohio. The brother, the man who has just gone, was younger than Mr. Knapp, though he looked older. He was wild in his youth. When he left home it was in the night, and for some offense that would have brought him within reach of the law. Mr. Knapp never told me what it was, and I never asked. For 15 years nothing was heard of him. Mr. Knapp and I married, we had come to San Francisco, and he was already a rising man in the city. One day this man came. He had drifted to the coast in some lawless enterprise and by chance found his brother." Mrs. Knapp paused. "And at once began to live off of him, I suppose?" I threw in as an encouragement to proceed. "Not exactly," said Mrs. Knapp. "He confessed some of his rascality to Mr. Knapp, but pleaded that he was anxious to reform. Mr. Knapp agreed to help him, but made the condition that he should take another name, and should never allow the relationship to be known. Mr. Lane, I cannot call him by his true name, was ready to agree to the conditions. I think he was very glad indeed to conceal himself under an assumed name, and hide from the memory of his earlier years." "Had his crimes then been so great?" I asked, as Mrs. Knapp again ceased to speak. "He had been a wicked, wicked man," said Mrs. Knapp. "The full tale of his villainy I never knew, but he had been a negro stealer, one of those who captured free negroes or the darkies from Kentucky and Missouri, in the days before the war, and sold them down the river. He had been the leader of a wild band in Arkansas and Texas, who made their living by robbing travelers and stealing horses. He had been near death 100 times, yet he had escaped unhurt. Mr. Knapp helped him. He prospered in business, bought a ranch, and turned farmer. To all appearances he had reformed completely. No one would suspect in the Sonoma rancher the daring leader of the outlaws in Texas." "I could believe anything of him," I said grimly. "You have had a taste of his quality," said Mrs. Knapp. "Well, it was 7 years ago that he married. His wife was much younger than he, a lovely girl, and her parents were rich. How he got her I do not see. It was his gift of the tongue, I suppose, for he could talk well. She was not happy with him, but was better contented when, 2 years later, her boy came. Mr. Lane was often from home, but I do not think she regretted the neglect with which he treated her. He was not a man who made his home pleasant while he was about. After a while he used to disappear for weeks, spending the time in low haunts in the city, or none knew where. Last year Mrs. Lane's father died, and she came in under the will for more than $1 million worth of property. Then Mr. Lane changed his habits. He became most attentive to his wife. He looked to her wants, and appeared to the world as a model husband. But more was going on than we knew. From the little she told me, from the hints she dropped, she must have looked upon him with dread. She failed rapidly in health, and 6 months ago she died." "Murdered?" I asked. "I believe it with all my soul," said Mrs. Knapp. "But there was no evidence, not a particle. I tried to find it, but it was beyond the power of the doctors to discover." "And his motive?" "He thought he was heir to her fortune. When he found that she had left it with Mr. Knapp and me, in trust for the boy, his rage was frightful to see. His servants told me of his dreadful ravings. He dared not say a word to Mr. Knapp, but he came and spoke to me about it. I was afraid for my life that time. He said that the money was his, and he said it with such meaning that I felt assured he would stop at nothing to get it. But when he spoke, I cut him so short that he visited the house but once again. Before he had time to put any of his wicked thoughts into action, I took the boy to my home, thinking that there I could keep him in safety. Mr. Knapp pooh-poohed my fears, and when Mr. Lane made a demand for the child was in favor of giving him up. The father is the one to care for the boy, he said, and washed his hands of the whole matter." "Then Mr. Knapp had nothing to do with the affair, one way or the other?" "Oh, no, nothing at all. I believe, though, that Henry did use his name with the police, to deter them from interfering with our plans." I remembered Detective Coogan's words and knew that she was correct in this supposition. "Mr. Lane," she continued, "threatened legal proceedings. But knowing his own past, and knowing that I knew something of it too, he dared not begin them. Mr. Knapp's feelings in the matter had made me unwilling to keep the boy in my house, but at first I thought it the best way of protecting him, and had him with me. Then one night the house was broken into, and two men were discovered in the room where the boy usually slept. I had taken him to my own bed that night, for he was ailing, and so he escaped. The alarm was raised before they found him, and the men fled. Mr. Knapp was confident that they were ordinary housebreakers, but I knew better. I dared keep the boy there no longer, and called Henry Wilton to assist me in making him safe. He found a suitable house for the boy, and hired men to guard it. But after one experience in which the place was attacked and almost carried by storm, Henry thought it better to hide the boy and watch the enemy. The rest you know." Heaving a sigh as of relief, she went on: "Mr. Lane was insane, I am certain. I tried to have Mr. Knapp take steps to lock him up. But Mr. Knapp could not believe that his brother was so wicked as to wish to take the life of his own child, and shut his ears to the talk of his madness. I think he was fearful of a scandal in which the relationship should become known, and the stories of his brother's early days should come to the public. But there was a time, a few weeks ago, when I was near spurring Mr. Knapp to action. It was at the time of his trip to Virginia City. Mr. Lane came to the house while I was away, and scared the servants into fits with his threats and curses. Luella had the courage and tact to face him and get him out of the house, and I telegraphed for Mr. Knapp. I remember the occasion, though I didn't know what was going on. Well, Mr. Knapp was very angry, and had a long talk with Lane. He told me that the creature cried and pleaded for forgiveness, and promised amendment for the future. And Mr. Knapp believed him. Yet that very night you were assailed with Luella in Chinatown." The truth flashed on me. The groans and cries behind the locked door in Doddridge Knapp's office, the voices which were like to one man pleading and arguing with himself, were all explained. "I think the assault was something of an accident," she continued. "Or, rather, it was more the doing of Terrill than of Lane." "What was the cause of Terrill's enmity?" I asked. "He seemed to take a hearty personal interest in the case for a hired man." "For one thing, a family interest. I think he is a son of Lane's early years. For another, he had a violent personal quarrel with Henry over some matter, and you have had the benefit of the enmity. But I don't think you'll hear of him again, or Meeker either. They will be in too much of a hurry to leave the state." I thought of Terrill lying bruised and sore at Livermore, and felt no fear of him. "You took great chances in sending me to Livermore," I said. "It might have gone hard with Mr. Knapp's plans if I had not got back." "I thought of that. But if the boy had been where I supposed, all would have been well. I should have telegraphed you before nightfall to return. But in the distraction of my search I did not give up till midnight. I left a telegram at the office to be sent you the first thing in the morning, but by that time you were here. It was a bold escape, and I feel that we owe you much for it." At her last words we were at the wharf, and landed free from fear. An hour later I reached my lodgings, sore with fatigue, and half dead for want of sleep. The excitement that had spurred my strength for the last enterprise no longer supported me. I slept 24 hours in peace, and no dream of Doddridge Knapp's brother or of the snake eyes of Tom Terrill disturbed my repose. End of chapter 30. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 31 of Blindfolded. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott. Chapter 31. The Reward. "I've heard about you," said Luella, when on the next morning I made my bow to her. "But I want to hear all about it from yourself. Tell me, please." "Where shall I begin?" I asked, looking into the most charming of faces, which shone before me. "How stupid to ask! At the beginning, of course." "I was born of poor but honest parents," I began. Luella interrupted me with a laugh. "How absurd you are! Anyhow, you can tell me about that later. Just begin with the San Francisco beginning. Tell me why you came and all about it." "Very good," I said, "though really this part is much longer than the other." Then I told her the story of my coming, of the murder of Henry Wilton, of the struggles with death and difficulty that had given the spice of variety to my life since I had come across the continent. It was an inspiration to have such a listener. Under the encouragement of her sympathy I found an unwonted flow of words and ideas. Laughter and tears shone in her eyes as the ludicrous and sorrowful parts of my experience touched her by turns. And at the end I found, I really don't know how it happened, I found that I was clasping her hand and looking up into her eyes in a trance of intoxication from the subtle magnetism of her lovely presence. For a minute we were silent. "Oh," she cried softly, withdrawing her hand and looking dreamily away. "I knew it was right, that it must be right. You have justified my faith, and more." "I am repaid for all by those words," I said. I am afraid I stared very hard at her, but it was pleasant, indeed, to look into Luella's eyes without any reservations or conscientious qualms in thinking of my duty to hang her father. "You deserve a much greater reward than that," said Luella. "I want a much greater reward than that," said I boldly. I did not think the courage was in me. But under the magnetic influence of the woman before me, I forgot what a poor devil I was. Luella looked at me, and I saw in her eyes that she understood what I would say. I do not know what I did say. I have no doubt it was very badly put, but she listened seriously. Then she said: "That's very nice of you to want me, but I am going to marry the president of the Omega Company." I turned sick with despair at these words so gently said, and a pang of fierce jealousy, tinged with wonder, shot through me. Surely she can't be in love with that red-faced brute we fought with in the Omega office, I thought. That was impossible. Besides, we had turned him out. Doddridge Knapp would be president as soon as the new board of directors elected its officers. She couldn't, of course, think of marrying her own father. I could not understand what she meant. But I knew I was furiously uncomfortable and wished I was rich enough to buy up the company. Luella saw my distress as I tried to rise and fly from the place. "Don't go," she said gently.
What are you going to do with your men?" "The Free Companions are to be disbanded," I said, recovering myself with a gulp. "Are any of them killed?" she asked in solicitous tones. "No. Porter is pretty badly hurt. We got him down from Livermore today. He was in the jail there, with Abrams and Brown. We gave bail for them, and all the men are back at the Montgomery Street place. Barkhouse is getting on all right, and there are a few bruises and cuts scattered around in my flock. But they'll all be in trim for another fight in 2 or 3 weeks." "I suppose you'll be sorry to part with them." "They are a faithful set, but I've had enough excitement for a while." "And Mrs. Borton?" "Is to be buried tomorrow." "And you, Mr. Dudley?" This question struck me a little blank. I had really not thought of what I was going to do. "It's another case of an occupation gone," I said rather ruefully. "With the break-up of the plots and the close of the Omega deal, I am at the end of my employments." With this view of the question before me, I fell into a panic of regrets, and began to blush furiously at my folly in imagining for an instant that Luella could think of me for a husband. "No," said Luella thoughtfully. "You are just at the beginning." The tone, even more than the words, braced my nerves, and once more there glowed within me a generous courage of the future. "You are right. I thank you," I said feelingly. "I have faith in the opportunities." "And I have faith," said Luella. Then she stopped. "In the man, I hope?" I ventured. Luella did not answer, but she gave me a look that meant more than words. I was a trifle bewildered, wondering where I stood in the eyes of this capricious young woman, but my speculations were cut short by the coming of Mrs. Knapp. There was no reservation in her greeting. Whatever lingering doubts of me her mind had held, they had all melted away in the fire of that last journey that had ended the struggle for the life of the boy. As we talked over the events of the month, I found nothing left of the silent opposition with which she had watched my growing friendship with the daughter of the house. At last she cried: "Oh, I had almost forgotten. Mr. Knapp wishes to see you in his room before you go." "I am at his service," I said, and went at once to the den of the Wolf. "Ah, Wilton! I find you're not Wilton," he growled amiably. The loss of his brother had not affected his spirits. "Quite true," I said. "You needn't explain," he said. "The women folks say it's all right, though I don't quite understand it myself." "I can tell you the story," I said. "I don't want to hear it," he growled. "I've tried you, and that's enough for me." I murmured my appreciation and thanks for his good opinion. The Wolf waved his hand as a disposal of all acknowledgments, and growled again: "Have you any engagements that would keep you from taking the place of president of the Omega Company?" I fell back on the chair, speechless. "There'll be a good salary," he continued. "Well, of course you needn't be in a hurry to accept. Take a day to think over it, if you like." The Wolf actually smiled. "Oh, I don't need any time," I gasped. "I'll take it now." "Well, you'll have to wait till the directors meet," he said. I gave him my hearty thanks for the unlooked-for favor. "To tell you the truth," he said, "it was the doing of the women folks." My heart gave a leap at the announcement, for it carried a great deal more with it than Doddridge Knapp knew. "I am 1,000 times obliged to you and the ladies," I said.
Well, I wasn't unwilling, he said indulgently. In fact, I intended to do something handsome for you. But there's one condition I must make. I looked my inquiry. You must not speculate. You haven't got the head for it. Thank you, I said. I'll keep out, except under your orders. Right, he said. You've the best head for carrying out orders I ever found. The King of the Street waved me good night, and I went back to the parlor. Luella was sitting where I had left her, and no one else was about. She was looking demurely down, and did not glance up till I was beside her. I have won a double prize, I said. I am the President of Omega. And I stooped and kissed her. End of chapter 31. Recording by Roger Moline. End of Blindfolded by Earle Ashley Walcott.